70,000 screaming fans, a $40 million NFL contract, the blinding halogen lights of Gillette Stadium. This is the absolute pinnacle of American success. But at 3:23 a.m., in the muddy, desolate gravel of a Massachusetts industrial park, that glittering facade shatters. A man lies in the dirt, executed. The transition is violently jarring. A gridiron icon didn't merely fall from grace. He drove a rented silver sedan straight into the abyss. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Bristol, Connecticut is a blue-collar town where the local hierarchy is largely dictated by high school football. Aaron grew up under the heavy, uncompromising hand of his father, Dennis. A former athlete and neighborhood legend, Dennis enforced a rigid household code governed by severe discipline and physical punishment. Mistakes were met with immediate, harsh consequences. Aaron learned early to compartmentalize his suffering, projecting a stoic athletic perfection to the outside world while navigating a highly volatile domestic reality. The foundation cracked permanently in January 2006. Dennis entered the hospital for routine hernia surgery, but contracted a lethal infection, passing away suddenly. Aaron was just 16 years old. The loss of his primary source of authority and structure shattered him. He rebelled aggressively against his mother, feeling deeply alienated when she quickly moved into a new relationship. The grieving teenager severed his familial emotional ties, seeking a new brotherhood within the gritty, hyper-masculine street culture of his hometown. Anger became his default mechanism. He began covering his body in heavy ink, a visual armor masking a profound psychological fracture. Despite his internal chaos, his physical talent was undeniable. He was heavily recruited by the University of Florida, stepping onto a campus where elite athletes operated in an insulated reality. The warning signs were immediate and glaring. During his freshman year in 2007, an altercation at a local bar over an unpaid bill resulted in him striking a restaurant employee with enough force to rupture the man's eardrum. He claimed self-defense to the authorities, and the incident was quietly smoothed over by the athletic establishment. Weeks later, he was brought in for questioning in connection with a drive-by shooting in Gainesville that left 2 men wounded at a traffic light. Detectives noted his unnervingly blank, cold demeanor during the interview before he invoked his right to counsel and shut down the interrogation. He failed multiple drug tests for marijuana, yet the football program's protective bubble shielded him from any real-world accountability. He absorbed a dangerous, lifelong lesson. Exceptional talent pardoned all sins. By the time the 2010 NFL Draft arrived, every franchise possessed detailed dossiers on his troubled background. A player of his caliber should have been a guaranteed first-round selection. Instead, teams passed on him repeatedly, citing severe character concerns and erratic, aggressive behavior. He endured a humiliating wait, watching his peers get drafted while he plummeted to the 4th round before the New England Patriots finally took a calculated risk. The organization believed their notoriously disciplined locker room culture could tame the turbulent prospect. On paper, the gamble paid off brilliantly. By age 22, he was catching touchdown passes in the Super Bowl. He secured a $40 million contract extension, cementing his status as a cornerstone of an athletic dynasty. He purchased a sprawling 7,100 square foot mansion in the upscale, manicured suburb of North Attleboro. From the outside, it was the ultimate American redemption arc, a grieving kid from a tough town who channeled his pain into professional greatness. He smiled for the cameras, delivered measured, polite answers at press conferences, and wore the polished veneer of an elite professional. But the geographical distance from his past was an illusion. The paranoid, hyper-vigilant street mentality he cultivated as a traumatized teenager only intensified with his newfound wealth. The pristine locker rooms and corporate sponsorships masked a man actively financing his old, dangerous allegiances. He was an apex predator on the gridiron, and the psychological boundaries between the brutal game and his everyday reality were rapidly dissolving. Odin Lloyd was everything Aaron pretended to be, authentically grounded in his own skin. A 27-year-old linebacker for the semi-pro Boston Bandits, Odin played purely for the visceral love of the hit. He spent his days working grueling manual labor for a local landscaping company just to pay his bills, a reality far removed from chartered team jets and stadium luxury suites. Their disparate worlds collided through domestic proximity. The NFL star was engaged to his high school sweetheart, Cheyenne Jenkins. When Cheyenne's sister, Shania, began a romantic relationship with Odin, the millionaire athlete and the landscaper were suddenly thrust into the same tight familial orbit. Initially, the dynamic was functional, if not entirely equal. Odin provided a highly reliable connection for the premium marijuana Aaron consumed in staggering quantities to manage his chronic physical pain and psychological unrest. They frequented exclusive nightclubs together, navigating VIP sections as a unit. To Odin, Aaron was a superstar peer who had beaten the odds. To Aaron, Odin was a convenient utility, a tether to the gritty street culture he utterly refused to abandon. But the manufactured domestic tranquility of the sprawling North Attleboro estate was quietly suffocating the tight end. Sharing a home with his fiancée and their newborn daughter required a level of emotional presence and baseline stability he simply did not possess. To manage the immense cognitive dissonance between his strict corporate athletic obligations and his deeply ingrained street mentality, he constructed a physical boundary. He signed a lease on a secret apartment in neighboring Franklin, a pristine two-bedroom unit completely detached from his heavily scrutinized public identity. This was the Flophouse. It was a sterile, shadowy sanctuary where the athlete could entertain out-of-town associates, consume heavy narcotics away from the eyes of the team's security apparatus, and stockpile an ever-growing arsenal of unregistered firearms. The Franklin apartment represented the darkest corners of his mind made physical. Black duffel bags sat in the corners, heavy with ammunition and high-capacity magazines. Weapons were stashed under mattresses and tucked into bathroom cabinets. He meticulously compartmentalized his existence, moving seamlessly between mandatory morning film sessions at the Patriots facility and the dimly lit, smoke-filled rooms of his secondary residence. He was living two entirely incompatible lives, and the psychological toll of maintaining that partition was beginning to manifest in terrifying ways. As the spring of 2013 approached, the meticulously constructed walls between his two identities began to rapidly collapse. The catalyst was a profound, unchecked paranoia that poisoned his daily interactions. He became utterly convinced that unseen enemies were shadowing his every move, tracking his luxury vehicles on the highway and plotting his execution. He authorized the installation of an elaborate 14-camera commercial surveillance system around the perimeter of his suburban mansion, turning the property into a fortified compound. He obsessively monitored the high-definition feeds from his smartphone, watching the empty driveway for hours. His behavior in public became wildly erratic. He refused to sit with his back to the door in restaurants, constantly scanning the room for threats. He carried a loaded .45 caliber handgun, concealed in his waistband to upscale Boston lounges, terrified of a phantom menace that lived entirely inside his own deteriorating neurochemistry. He felt entirely isolated, trusting absolutely no one, not his teammates, not his coaching staff, and increasingly not his own inner circle. In his distorted, hyper-vigilant reality, unconditional respect was the only currency that mattered, and any perceived slight was instantly magnified into an unforgivable, lethal betrayal. Odin occupied a uniquely dangerous space in this fractured landscape. Because of their shared social circles and late-night excursions, he witnessed the unraveling firsthand. He saw the weapons cache in the Franklin apartment. He experienced the sudden, drug-fueled mood swings that could turn a celebratory evening into a tense, silent standoff. The fatal breaking point materialized during a weekend out at a crowded Boston nightclub. Through the pulsing lights and heavy bass, Aaron observed Odin exchanging casual greetings with a specific group of men across the room. In a healthy, rational mind, this is a meaningless social interaction. In Aaron's paranoid, fractured psyche, it was a blatant act of treason. He believed those specific men were affiliated with rivals who had disrespected him in the past. The internal logic was deeply twisted. If Odin was speaking to his enemies, Odin was actively conspiring against him. The NFL star stewed in a silent, simmering rage for the remainder of the night. He felt profoundly disrespected, exposed, and vulnerable. The uncompromising, violent code he idolized demanded immediate retaliation for such disloyalty. The landscaping semi-pro player had unwittingly crossed an invisible line drawn by a man rapidly losing his grip on reality. A man who had already decided that the penalty for this infraction was absolute. The logistics of premeditated murder require a specific, cold-blooded focus. June 16, 2013 was Father's Day. While the rest of the country celebrated, the multi-million-dollar tight end was actively laying the groundwork for an execution. He understood that his fleet of custom luxury SUVs, the white Chevrolet Suburban, the matte black Audi, were far too conspicuous for what he had planned. He needed something invisible. Earlier in the week, he had visited a corporate car rental agency in Rhode Island, bypassing the high-end options to select a generic silver Nissan Altima. It was a phantom vehicle, the kind of mid-sized sedan that blends seamlessly into the endless flow of highway traffic, leaving no imprint on the memory of passing motorists or casual witnesses. With the transportation secured, he required manpower. The athlete reached out to his hometown of Bristol, summoning two men who operated entirely outside the polished corporate sphere of professional sports. Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz were street-level associates, individuals conditioned to follow orders without questioning the underlying rationale. He directed them to drive up to his Massachusetts compound immediately. The collision of his two worlds was now absolute. The pristine suburban mansion, equipped with a movie theater and an infant's nursery, served as the staging ground for a hit squad. As evening fell, the digital trap was set. Using his heavily monitored smartphone, the athlete began texting Odin Lloyd. The tone of the messages was deliberately casual, masking the lethal intent behind a facade of weekend camaraderie. He suggested they link up, indicating a plan to hit the Boston nightlife. In Dorchester, miles away from the sprawling North Attleboro estate, Odin read the messages and began to get ready. He anticipated a standard evening of VIP tables, loud music, and free-flowing alcohol, alongside a man he considered a friend and a peer. He trusted the man who was practically his brother-in-law. Odin put on a dark shirt, pocketed his wallet, and waited for his ride, completely unaware that the digital breadcrumbs of their communication were cementing a timeline that investigators would soon dissect minute by minute. The silver Nissan Altima began its journey north toward the city. The tension inside the cabin was palpable. This was not a party run. The vehicle was operating as a rolling containment unit. Cellular towers silently recorded the Altima's progression up the Interstate 95 corridor, pinging off receivers as the car closed the distance between the wealthy suburbs and the gritty city streets. At 2:32 a.m. on June 17th, the Altima idled outside Odin's residence in Boston. The 27-year-old landscaper walked out into the warm, humid night air and climbed into the back seat. The athlete was behind the wheel. Wallace and Ortiz occupied the other seats. The heavy doors slammed shut, the automatic locks engaged, and the atmospheric shift within the vehicle was immediate and suffocating. There was no music. There was no discussion of which club they were heading toward. The Altima simply merged onto the Massachusetts Turnpike and accelerated south, pointing back toward the dark, isolated stretches of the outer suburbs. The pacing of the night abruptly accelerated. Highway street lamps flickered across the windshield in a rapid, hypnotic rhythm. Odin was trapped in a moving metal box with three silent men. The paranoia radiating from the driver's seat was a physical weight in the confined space. The athlete's eyes constantly checked the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The route they were taking made absolutely no geographical sense for a night out in Boston. They were driving into the void. Odin's internal alarm bells finally shattered the illusion of a social outing. He recognized the landscape shifting from urban density to sparse wooded stretches. The danger was sudden and absolute. Operating purely on a desperate instinct for survival, he pulled out his cell phone. He could not make a call without triggering an immediate, violent reaction from the men surrounding him. Instead, he relied on text messages. At 3:07 a.m., he messaged his sister. He asked if she had seen who he left the house with. She was asleep, her phone resting quietly on a nightstand, completely unaware that her brother was documenting the final moments of his own life. 4 minutes later, Odin sent a follow-up text, explicitly identifying his company. He typed out the letters NFL. A final message pushed through the digital ether. He stated that he just wanted her to know. It was a digital flare fired into the dark, a frantic, quiet attempt to leave a record of his captors before the inevitable occurred. The Altima exited the highway. The smooth asphalt gave way to secondary roads, twisting through the sleeping, affluent neighborhoods of North Attleboro. The driver knew exactly where he was going. He navigated the quiet streets with lethal precision, heading toward John DeFazio Drive. It was an unfinished, commercial industrial park located less than a mile from his own sprawling mansion. At 3:22 a.m., the sedan turned off the pavement. The tires crunched violently over loose gravel and packed dirt. The headlights swept across a desolate, moonlit landscape of construction debris, heavy excavation machinery, and empty lots surrounded by dense woods. There were no cameras here. There were no witnesses. The vehicle rolled to a stop in a secluded clearing, the engine idling low in the absolute stillness of the night. The execution was mechanical, frantic, and devoid of hesitation. The doors opened. The heavy, damp June air flooded the cabin. Odin was ordered out of the vehicle into the darkness. There was no drawn-out confrontation, no dramatic monologue. Just the raw, deafening mechanics of a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun shattering the silence of the industrial park. 5 shots, fired in rapid, chaotic succession. The flashes of the muzzle illuminated the dirt and the trees for brief, blinding fractions of a second. The impacts were devastating, striking the victim in the chest and back. Odin collapsed backward into the gravel, his life extinguishing in the dirt of a construction site. In the frantic, adrenaline-fueled chaos of the shooting, a critical, fatal error occurred. Odin fell with the rental keys to the silver Nissan Altima still tucked deep inside his pocket. The shooter scrambled back into the vehicle. The engine roared. The Altima reversed violently, its tires spinning and spitting a shower of rocks and dirt into the brush. The car sped out of the industrial park, leaving the broken body behind. Less than 2 minutes later, the silver sedan pulled through the iron gates of a multi-million-dollar compound. High-definition security cameras mounted on the eaves of the mansion captured the athlete walking calmly through his own front door, a firearm clearly gripped in his left hand, stepping back into a world of ultimate privilege just moments after stepping out of a slaughter. The humid afternoon of June 17th brought an oppressive, stagnant heat to the region. At approximately 5:30 p.m., a teenage jogger charted his usual route through the unfinished, quiet lots of the John DeFazio Drive Industrial Park. The area was a desolate expanse of packed dirt, overgrown brush, and idle excavation equipment, a place entirely devoid of foot traffic. As the runner passed a secluded clearing, his eyes caught an unnatural shape resting in the gravel. At first glance, he assumed it was a local transient sleeping off a heavy weekend. But as he drew closer, the sharp, metallic odor of turned earth and drying blood overwhelmed the smell of the surrounding pine trees. The awkward, rigid angle of the man's limbs dispelled any illusion of sleep. The teenager stopped entirely, his pulse hammering against his ribs, and pulled out his phone to contact emergency services. The transition from a quiet suburban afternoon to an active homicide scene was rapid and absolute. North Attleboro patrol cruisers flooded the dirt access road, their tires kicking up thick clouds of dust that hung heavy in the muggy air. First responders immediately cordoned off the brush with yellow tape, establishing a strict perimeter around the clearing. Crime scene technicians arrived shortly after, beginning their methodical, sterile documentation of a brutal execution. The victim was lying face up. Rigor mortis had firmly set in, anchoring his body to the gravel. Forensics documented multiple entrance wounds, devastating close-range trauma to the chest and back that indicated a highly localized and aggressive assault. The physical evidence scattered in the dirt told a clear, violent story. Investigators logged 5 brass .45 caliber shell casings gleaming dully in the late afternoon sun. The tight grouping of the spent ammunition suggested the shooter had stood directly over the victim, firing downward in rapid succession. Just a few feet away, deep, aggressive tire tracks scarred the soft soil, mapping a frantic, high-speed exit where a vehicle had reversed violently out of the clearing. Detectives systematically searched the victim's clothing to establish an identity. In his back pocket, they retrieved a wallet containing a Massachusetts driver's license. The deceased was identified as Odin Lloyd, but it was the contents of his front pocket that transformed a tragic, isolated homicide into an international spectacle. A technician pulled out a set of standard electronic car keys attached to a corporate rental agency fob. A patrol officer clicked the unlock button, listening intently for a responsive chirp, but the clearing remained completely silent. There was no vehicle parked anywhere in the vicinity. The lead detective radioed the barcode on the black plastic fob back to Central Dispatch, requesting an immediate trace on the agency's inventory system. Minutes passed in the sweltering heat of the industrial park before the radio crackled back with the registration data. The response landed with the weight of an anvil. The keys belonged to a silver Nissan sedan. The active rental agreement was registered exclusively to Aaron Hernandez. The gravity of the investigation instantly shifted. Law enforcement was no longer just working a gang-related execution. They were actively investigating the most famous, heavily scrutinized resident of their town. Detectives left the dusty perimeter of the crime scene and drove the short distance, less than a single mile, to the sprawling, gated driveway of the athlete's multi-million-dollar compound. Plainclothes officers approached the heavy wooden double doors of the estate. The tight end answered the knock. His demeanor was entirely devoid of the charismatic warmth he regularly projected on television. He was cold, intensely guarded, and stood rigidly within the threshold of his home. When investigators informed him they were looking into a death connected to a vehicle rented in his name, his face remained a blank, stoic mask. He firmly declined to answer any inquiries, directing the detectives to contact his legal counsel before retreating back into the air-conditioned safety of his fortress and deadbolting the door. By the following morning, the scanner chatter had inevitably leaked to local and national news outlets. The quiet, insulated airspace of the affluent suburb was suddenly fractured by the heavy, chopping rhythm of news helicopters circling the mansion in continuous loops. Satellite trucks paralleled parked along the pristine sidewalks, transforming the manicured streets into a chaotic media encampment. Neighbors, accustomed to seeing the gridiron star casually walking his dogs or pulling out of his driveway in a luxury SUV, stood on their front lawns in absolute disbelief. The cognitive dissonance was staggering for the local community. This was a wealthy, highly secure enclave where crime was virtually non-existent. The residents struggled fiercely to reconcile the polished image of the philanthropic sports icon with the grim, surreal reality of an active homicide unit processing evidence on his front lawn. Whispers and rampant speculation swept through the neighborhood like a contagion. As reporters aimed their telephoto lenses at the drawn blinds of the expansive property, the myth of the hometown hero began to rapidly, publicly crumble, replaced by the terrifying realization that a predator had been living quietly among them. The initial phase of the homicide investigation slammed into an impenetrable, heavily financed wall. Within hours of the detectives' arrival at the mansion, an elite team of Boston defense attorneys descended on the local police precinct. They enacted a total blockade. The suspect was insulated, completely untouchable behind the wrought iron gates of his compound and the aggressive legal maneuvering of his representatives. Detectives were denied interviews. Requests for voluntary evidence submission were met with flat, immediate rejections. For the first 48 hours, the investigative momentum stalled entirely. Desperate for a breakthrough, local law enforcement and state troopers chased a frustrating series of dead ends. They operated on the initial assumption that the execution was tied to a Boston narcotics dispute, given the victim's known associations. Detectives wasted critical daylight hours tracking down local gang affiliates in Dorchester and Roxbury, pulling field interview cards, and questioning street-level informants who offered nothing but silence or deliberate misinformation. Dive teams waded through murky, 70-degree retention ponds along the highway, and K-9 units scoured miles of dense, thorny brush near the industrial park, hunting for the murder weapon. They found discarded rusted metal, old tires, and trash, but absolutely no trace of a .45 caliber handgun. The gridiron star watched the futile search from the air-conditioned comfort of his home, exuding a quiet, arrogant confidence. He firmly believed he had outsmarted the system. He was wrong. The foundation of his defense began to crumble not through a grand, sweeping discovery, but through an infinitesimally small, sloppy mistake left inside the returned rental vehicle. Investigators secured a warrant to impound and process the silver Nissan Altima, which had been hastily returned to the corporate agency lot. The exterior had been washed, the interior had been vacuumed. It appeared entirely sterilized, but as forensic technicians methodically dismantled the cabin, pulling up the floor mats and examining the mechanical tracks of the seats, they discovered a hidden anomaly. Lodged deep beneath the driver's seat was a single spent .45 caliber brass shell casing. It had rolled backward during the frantic, high-speed escape from the industrial park, wedging itself completely out of sight. More damning than the brass itself was what it was attached to. The casing was firmly stuck to a piece of chewed blue bubblegum. The laboratory extraction was meticulous. Forensics isolated the saliva residue embedded within the sticky texture of the gum. The subsequent DNA profile generated a flawless, undeniable match. It was a direct biological tether connecting the athlete to the exact ammunition used in the execution. Armed with this irrefutable physical evidence, a judge signed a comprehensive search warrant for the North Attleboro estate. When a convoy of unmarked police cruisers breached the compound, they targeted the athlete's digital footprint. They demanded his cell phone. He complied, handing over his personal device without a hint of resistance. The reason for his compliance became immediately obvious. The smartphone had been intentionally, violently destroyed. The screen was shattered into fragments, the casing bent, the internal motherboard crushed. It was a stunning display of physical hubris. The man possessed a mindset forged by violence, operating under the deeply flawed assumption that brute force could erase digital history. He believed breaking the glass erased the data. Detectives simply bypassed the physical hardware, issuing federal subpoenas directly to the telecommunications providers. The retrieved server-side metadata was devastating. Cell tower pings mapped his exact, minute-by-minute progression from the affluent suburbs, up the interstate to the Boston pickup, and straight back to the gravel lot on John DeFazio Drive. The digital autopsy continued inside the mansion. Investigators located the control hub for the extensive 14-camera home surveillance network. The hard drive had been actively tampered with. Cables were unceremoniously yanked from their ports, and critical blocks of footage covering the early morning hours of June 17th had been manually deleted. The suspect had attempted to scrub his own return to the property. But digital forensics experts slowly reconstructed the corrupted sectors of the drive. They extracted the ghost data, pulling the deleted files back from the void. The recovered frames were chilling in their clarity. They showed the athlete walking through his front door just moments after the recorded time of death. In his left hand, he loosely gripped a dark, heavy object. Image enhancement specialists confirmed it was a Glock semi-automatic pistol. While it was not the weapon used in the execution, the footage utterly destroyed his carefully crafted alibi, legally establishing him as an armed aggressor at the precise time he claimed to be asleep. The final pillar of his defense collapsed when investigators traced the recovered text messages to his accomplices. The metadata exposed the identities of the two men summoned from Bristol. A coordinated multi-state manhunt was immediately initiated. The associates, lacking the millions of dollars and the fortified compounds of their leader, panicked. They fled the region, leaving sloppy paper trails across state lines. Law enforcement tracked them down in Connecticut and Florida, taking them into custody with overwhelming tactical force. Faced with the terrifying reality of life behind bars, the street code of silence instantly evaporated. The accomplices broke under interrogation. They detailed the suffocating paranoia of the car ride, the dark deviation into the industrial park, and the sudden deafening roar of the gunfire. They confirmed the athlete pulled the trigger. The endgame arrived on the humid morning of June 26th. The neighborhood, already exhausted by the unrelenting media circus, watched the final, inevitable act unfold. At 8:45 a.m., detectives marched up the long, manicured driveway. The heavy wooden doors opened one last time. The gridiron icon was escorted out, his wrists locked in rigid steel handcuffs behind his back. He wore a simple white t-shirt, his heavily tattooed arms exposed to the flashing cameras of the International Press Corps. Within 2 hours of his arrest, the New England Patriots officially terminated his contract, severing all ties. The protective corporate shield was instantly vaporized. The untouchable superstar was gone, replaced by a glaring, deeply flawed man standing in a holding cell, entirely consumed by the very darkness he had refused to leave behind. The trial commenced in late January 2015, operating under a suffocating layer of media scrutiny. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution meticulously dismantled the athlete's fabricated reality. When his former street associates took the stand, they testified under oath, recounting how their leader orchestrated the execution with mechanical precision. Through weeks of grueling testimony, the defendant's demeanor remained entirely disconnected. He sat rigidly at the defense table, his expression completely blank, demonstrating no visible reaction to the graphic crime scene photographs or the visceral grief radiating from Odin's family, seated just feet away. The charade finally ended on April 15th. The jury delivered a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. The judge immediately imposed the mandatory sentence of life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. 2 years later, the legal saga took a deeply perplexing turn. In early 2017, the fallen star stood trial for a separate double homicide stemming from a 2012 drive-by shooting in Boston. Defense attorneys managed to inject enough reasonable doubt into the proceedings, resulting in a stunning acquittal. He wept openly as that verdict was read, seemingly overwhelmed by a rare legal victory. He was cleared of the past, yet permanently condemned for the present. On April 19, 2017, just days after his unexpected legal victory, the remaining facade collapsed. Inside a solitary 10 by 14 foot maximum security cell, the 27-year-old took his own life. The subsequent medical autopsy revealed a deeply disturbing pathology. His brain exhibited the most severe case of chronic traumatic encephalopathy ever seen in a man his age. The advanced physical decay of his frontal lobe left a dark, unresolved question hanging over the tragedy. Was the violence born from street allegiance, unchecked arrogance, or a relentlessly deteriorating mind? If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Late November in Knox County, Tennessee. The air outside is crisp, but inside the house on Golden View Lane, the thermostat is cranked to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The suffocating stench of bleach, sewer gas, and melting plastic violently assaults the senses. In the kitchen, a large stainless steel stock pot sits on the stove. The burner is still warm. Inside that pot, simmering in a toxic chemical soup, is the severed head of a 55-year-old mother. This wasn't the work of a phantom serial killer. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and her son had just come home for the holidays. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy were the embodiment of the quiet American dream. After decades of relentless labor, the couple was finally staring down the barrel of a well-deserved retirement. Joel, a pipeline engineering designer, was known for his meticulous nature and sharp intellect. Lisa worked in accounts payable at a local engineering firm in Knoxville. She was the absolute heart of the family, a woman deeply devoted to her children from previous relationships and the one son she shared with Joel. By the fall of 2016, the couple had spent 31 years together. Their two-story brick home on Golden View Lane was a comfortable suburban anchor, but it was simply too much space for two empty nesters. They had recently purchased a secluded property 80 miles northeast in Surgensville. It was a quiet rural retreat where they planned to spend their twilight years off the grid, out of the corporate rat race, and focused entirely on each other. The Knoxville house was already on the market. Moving boxes were stacked in the living room and hallways. The transition to the next phase of their lives was in full swing. However, securing that retirement required a strict recalibration of their finances. For nearly a decade, Joel and Lisa had carried a massive, hidden burden, an ongoing financial hemorrhage that prevented them from truly moving forward. That drain was their 28-year-old son, Joel Michael Guy Jr. While his 3 older half-sisters had long since built independent, successful lives, Joel Jr. remained fully tethered to his parents' bank accounts. He resided over 500 miles away in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. To the outside world, he was an eternal academic. He had been taking college courses on and off for 9 consecutive years, ostensibly studying at Louisiana State University to become a plastic surgeon. In reality, he lacked any clear trajectory and hadn't held a steady job his entire adult life. His existence in Baton Rouge was an impenetrable bubble of extreme isolation. He lived in an apartment funded exclusively by his mother and father. They paid his rent, his tuition, his utilities, and deposited a generous monthly stipend for his living expenses. Joel Jr. rarely left his space. He had no documented friends, no romantic relationships, and maintained a fiercely guarded, solitary routine. Relatives described him as highly intelligent but unsettlingly detached. When he did visit Tennessee for the holidays, he was a phantom in his own home, socially awkward, preferring the confines of a guest bedroom to the warmth of family gatherings. He would often stare blankly during conversations, completely disengaged from the world around him. The contrast was stark. Joel Sr. and Lisa were outgoing, deeply embedded in their local community, and universally regarded as generous to a fault. Their son was an anomaly they constantly had to accommodate. But as the Surgeonsville move rapidly approached, the financial math simply no longer worked. Joel Sr. and Lisa sat down and made the most agonizing decision a parent can face. They were going to permanently sever the financial umbilical cord. They formulated a clear plan. They would inform Joel Jr. that they would no longer cover his rent, tuition, or daily expenses. Thanksgiving of 2016 was chosen as the absolute deadline. They arranged to bring him up from Louisiana, intending to host one final lavish holiday dinner in the Golden View Lane home. Once the plates were cleared, they would sit him down and deliver the ultimatum. It was meant to be a firm push toward adulthood, a necessary act of tough love designed to force their reclusive son to finally step into the real world. The financial tether wasn't just a convenience for the son living in Louisiana. It was the entire structural foundation of his reality. Without the steady, monthly deposits from his mother and father, his isolated existence would instantly disintegrate. For nearly a decade, he had fiercely shielded himself from the demands of society, hiding behind the impenetrable guise of a perpetual medical student. The prospect of securing a job, paying his own rent, or interacting with the harsh realities of the world outside his Baton Rouge apartment was not merely a frustrating inconvenience. To a mind as rigidly compartmentalized and detached as his, it was a catastrophic existential threat. The Baton Rouge apartment was a vacuum. There were no visitors, no ringing phones, no spontaneous social interactions, just the low hum of the air conditioner and the harsh glare of a computer screen. When the ultimatum began to crystallize in the weeks leading up to the holiday, something within that silent apartment fundamentally fractured. The parents genuinely believed they were offering a necessary push toward self-sufficiency. They had spent months agonizing over the decision. The mother's fierce protective instinct had constantly battled against the father's pragmatic realization that they would literally never be able to afford retirement if they kept writing checks. They openly discussed their tightened budget with their daughters, admitting that keeping their adult son afloat was draining their accounts dry. The Golden View Lane property was already sold. The rural retreat 80 miles away was waiting. The transition was absolute, and the financial spigot had to be turned off. But the son did not process this as tough love or parental guidance. He perceived it as a profound, unforgivable betrayal. If the financial lifeline was severed, the parents who provided it immediately outlived their usefulness. Worse, they possessed tangible assets. There were life insurance policies totaling $500,000. There would be proceeds from the imminent sale of the Knoxville property. A dark, terrifyingly clinical logic began to take root. If they were gone, the assets would automatically transfer to him as the next of kin. The financial support wouldn't just continue, it would become permanent, and he would never have to answer to them again. The psychological shift from dependent child to calculating predator was entirely methodical. It did not manifest in a sudden, explosive fit of rage. It was engineered meticulously over weeks. Before even packing a single piece of clothing for the holiday, the preparations commenced. He moved through the aisles of hardware stores and supermarkets in Louisiana with a sterile, focused objective. He acquired items that had absolutely no place in a Thanksgiving suitcase. Heavy-duty clear polyethylene tarps, gallons of concentrated acid, industrial drain cleaner, bleach, a sturdy hunting knife with a heavy, fixed blade. He felt the weight of the chemicals, the slosh of the caustic liquids inside their thick plastic jugs. He packed these supplies into the trunk of his vehicle, effectively creating a mobile arsenal of destruction, and began the long drive northeast to Tennessee. He arrived in Knox County on Wednesday, November 23rd. The atmosphere inside the home was already chaotic, filled with half-packed cardboard moving boxes, rolls of packing tape, and the general disarray of a family in heavy transition. His mother was overjoyed to see him, embracing him at the front door, completely oblivious to the lethal cargo sitting just yards away in the driveway. Thanksgiving Day brought a full house. The older half-sisters arrived to celebrate what was supposed to be a joyous, nostalgic milestone, the final holiday meal in the childhood home before the parents relocated for good. The dining room was loud, filled with the rich smells of roasted meat, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, and warm conversations about the future. Yet the guest of honor remained a ghost. He was physically present at the table, but psychologically, he was miles away. He barely engaged with his siblings. When spoken to directly, he offered brief, monotone responses, his eyes constantly darting away to focus on the wall, refusing to hold human contact. He spent the vast majority of the afternoon retreated in his upstairs guest bedroom, pacing the floorboards, isolating himself from the warmth radiating just one floor below. His sisters noted his bizarre, withdrawn behavior, chalking it up to his usual intense social awkwardness. They had grown accustomed to his eccentricities over the years. No one at that table could possibly fathom that he wasn't just being antisocial. He was quietly evaluating them, calculating timelines, and waiting for the witnesses to leave. The tension underneath the festive surface was heavy and palpable. The impending conversation about his financial cutoff hung in the air, unspoken but acutely felt by the parents. They had strategically planned to wait until the holiday festivities officially concluded before delivering the final verdict. They wanted to preserve the peace of the Thanksgiving dinner, unaware that their silence was only feeding his internal countdown. By Friday afternoon, the dynamic fundamentally shifted. The house began to empty out. The half-sisters hugged their father and mother goodbye in the driveway, wishing them a safe and happy weekend, and drove back to their respective lives. They would be the last family members to see the couple breathing. Now it was just the three of them. The residual noise of the holiday completely faded, replaced only by the quiet ticking of the living room clock and the dull rustle of cardboard boxes being shifted. The son remained upstairs behind a closed door. His parents went about their normal evening routine, mentally rehearsing the incredibly difficult financial conversation they intended to have the next morning. They were preparing to close one chapter of their lives and open another, entirely unaware that their son had already written the ending. Up in the second-floor bedroom, the luggage was unzipped. The heavy hunting knife was unsheathed from its casing. The thick plastic tarps were unrolled. The meticulous clinical plan that had been drafted in the total isolation of Baton Rouge was about to be executed. He was no longer viewing his mother and father as human beings with histories and heartbeats. They were simply obstacles. They were a financial transaction that needed to be forcibly, violently finalized. The house settled into a deep, quiet Friday night. The temperature outside began to drop below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Upstairs, he sat in the silence and simply waited for the optimal moment to strike. Saturday, November 26th. The looming financial cutoff conversation never happened. Joel Sr. and Lisa woke up, entirely unaware that their son's internal countdown had reached 0. The morning proceeded with the mundane rhythm of a typical holiday weekend. Around midday, Lisa grabbed her purse and car keys. She drove to a nearby Walmart to purchase groceries, perhaps picking up a few final provisions before her son's scheduled departure back to Louisiana. The heavy front door clicked shut, the deadbolt engaged. Joel Sr. was now alone in the house with the 28-year-old. Joel Sr. retreated to his upstairs exercise room. He stepped up to his workout equipment, settling into his daily physical routine. The house was dead quiet. Down the hall, the son unzipped his luggage. He retrieved a heavy-duty Bowen's hunting knife. The blade was thick, fixed, and razor-sharp. He walked silently down the carpeted hallway. There was no warning, no shouted argument, no hesitation. The ambush was immediate and devastating. The son lunged, driving the blade into his father's chest. But the 61-year-old pipeline engineer fought back, hard. The struggle was a chaotic, violently desperate collision of muscle and bone. They crashed into the exercise equipment. Blood splattered in a horrific, sweeping arc, coating the walls, soaking the workout gear, and staining the window blinds. The father fought for his life, grabbing frantically at the blade, trying to disarm the younger, heavier attacker. During the frantic grapple, the son's grip slipped on the blood-soaked handle. The razor-sharp edge sliced deep into his own hands, tearing through the flesh of his fingers. The pain was sharp. The adrenaline overrode it. He overpowered the older man. He delivered a relentless barrage of fatal strikes, piercing the lungs, the liver, and the kidneys. Joel Sr. collapsed onto the carpet. The heavy thud shook the second-story floorboards. The violent thrashing ceased. The room fell entirely silent, save for the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. The son stood over the body. His hands were bleeding profusely, dripping dark crimson onto the floor. This was a critical, dangerous deviation from his meticulously written plan. His private journal had not accounted for a brutal, hand-to-hand fight to the death. But the machine could not stop. The psychological detachment held firm. He grabbed his father's lifeless form. He began the grueling process of dragging the massive 200-pound man out of the exercise room and down the hallway. The dull, heavy drag of dead weight across the carpet. Fibers echoed through the empty second floor. He hauled the body into the master bathroom, dropping it over the porcelain lip of the bathtub. Then, he waited. Hours bled by. The afternoon stretched on in absolute silence. Finally, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway signaled the shift in the timeline. Lisa was home. She opened the front door, carrying plastic Walmart shopping bags. She walked into the kitchen, setting the items on the counter. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She did not notice the faint, coppery scent of blood drifting down the stairwell. She did not hear the calculated, heavy footsteps descending the wooden stairs behind her. The son stalked through the hallway. The hunting knife remained firmly in his lacerated grip. He approached his mother from behind as she stood near the entryway. The strike was instantaneous. The sheer velocity and force of the attack knocked her violently to the ground. Groceries scattered across the linoleum. Cans rolled into the corners. She had no time to process the betrayal, no time to fight back. The assault was an overkill of pure mechanical precision. 9 ribs were fractured. Her spine was severed. The blade moved with terrifying speed until all movement ceased. Lisa lay lifeless on the floor of the home she had worked 3 decades to build. The house was now a tomb. The son moved to the windows, pulling the blinds tight. He locked the doors. The violent phase was complete. Now, the clinical erasure had to begin. He retrieved the supplies purchased in Baton Rouge, the industrial chemicals, the heavy-duty 45-gallon plastic Tupperware bins, the thick polyethylene tarps. He dragged his mother's body upstairs to join his father's. The sheer physical exertion required for this phase was immense, but he operated with chilling, robotic efficiency. He transformed the upstairs bathrooms into an abattoir. He systematically dismembered the bodies of the people who had funded his entire existence. Limbs were severed at the joints. Torsos were separated. The blade cut through cartilage and bone. He executed the steps exactly as he had outlined in his private notebook, a terrifying manual detailing the precise anatomy and the exact tools required to dismantle a human form. He placed the segmented torsos and limbs into the large plastic containers. Then, he uncapped the industrial jugs. He poured a highly corrosive, toxic cocktail over the remains, a mixture of liquid drain cleaner, bleach, hydrogen peroxide, and sewer line chemicals. The instant the acid made contact with biological tissue, a violent chemical reaction triggered. The liquid began to bubble and churn. The air in the bathroom instantly turned toxic. A suffocating miasma of synthetic cleaning agents and decaying flesh filled the second floor, burning the eyes and searing the throat. It was an overwhelming, noxious haze. The ultimate act of depravity was reserved for the kitchen. He carried his mother's severed head downstairs. He opened the cabinets and selected a large, heavy-bottomed stainless steel stockpot. He placed the head inside, submerged it in the corrosive liquid mixture, and set the pot on the stove. He turned the dial. The blue flame ignited. The concoction began to heat, eventually reaching a rolling simmer. The hiss of the boiling liquid echoed in the empty kitchen. It was a calculated, horrific strategy designed to dissolve the facial tissue and destroy any identifying dental records. He knew that chemical decomposition required extreme temperatures. The late November air outside was chilling the house, slowing the acidic reaction. He walked to the central thermostat in the hallway. He violently cranked the dial up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. To amplify the effect, he plugged in portable space heaters inside the bathrooms and aimed them directly at the Tupperware bins. The house began to bake. The ambient heat caused the acidic slurry to react exponentially faster. The temperature inside the plastic containers skyrocketed. The thick walls of the Tupperware began to warp, bulge, and slowly melt from the sheer thermal pressure generating inside. It was now Sunday morning. The house was a pressurized oven of biological decay and blinding chemical vapor. But the plan was fracturing. The deep lacerations on the son's hands, sustained during the initial ambush, were severe. The bleeding wouldn't stop. The pain was becoming entirely unmanageable. He could not finish the cleanup. He wrapped his hands tightly in bandages. He grabbed his backpack containing the notebook and walked out the front door. He locked the deadbolt, leaving the heat blasting and the stove burner ignited. He got into his car and merged onto the interstate, heading straight south to Baton Rouge to seek medical treatment at a student health clinic. He fully intended to return and finish dissolving the evidence. He drove away, leaving behind a suburban home that was rapidly transforming into an unimaginable hellscape. Monday, November 28th. The corporate offices at Jacobs Engineering hummed with the standard, sterile rhythm of a new week. Lisa was the payroll administrator. Her role required absolute precision, and her attendance record was immaculate. By 9 a.m., her desk remained entirely empty. Her supervisor immediately noted the absence. By 10 a.m., repeated calls to her mobile phone routed directly to an automated voicemail system. This was a severe deviation from her established baseline. Her boss did not wait for a second day of absence to raise the alarm. He contacted the Knox County Sheriff's Office, citing her uncharacteristic disappearance, and officially requested a welfare check at the Golden View Lane residence. Patrol units navigated the quiet, manicured streets, pulling into the driveway just after noon. The exterior of the two-story brick home presented a facade of absolute suburban normalcy, save for a few subtle, deeply unsettling details. Both family vehicles, a truck and a mid-sized SUV, were parked exactly where they belonged. The mailbox was stuffed with uncollected weekend deliveries. Officers approached the heavy front door and knocked with the weight of authority. Total silence. Through the thick wood, they could only hear the muffled, frantic barking of a dog, isolated somewhere in the upper levels of the structure. They tested the brass doorknob. It was locked tight. The deputies initiated a standard perimeter sweep. They moved along the exterior walls, checking the lower-level windows for signs of forced entry. Cupping their hands against the cold glass to cut the glare, they peered into the kitchen. The visual was jarring. The linoleum floor was a chaotic mess of discarded plastic shopping bags. Packaged sausages, raw bacon, and a shattered glass bottle of syrup were strewn across the ground in a haphazard, violent scatter. It looked less like a clumsy drop and more like the immediate aftermath of a sudden, brutal disruption. That visual evidence established immediate probable cause to enter the premises. The deputies bypassed the main entrance, eventually finding an unlocked access point near the garage. They pushed the secondary door open. The atmosphere inside did not just hit them, it physically assaulted them. A solid wall of 90-degree heat rolled out of the threshold. The air was incredibly dense, heavy with a thick chemical fog that instantly burned their sinuses and caused their eyes to water. It was a suffocating, lethal amalgamation of concentrated bleach, industrial drain cleaner, and a foul, underlying sweetness that experienced law enforcement officers recognize instantly. The unmistakable scent of rapid biological decay. Gagging on the fumes, the deputies drew their sidearms and stepped into the suffocating thermal trap. The ambient heat was oppressive. Every single surface in the home felt coated in a thin, toxic film of vaporized chemicals. They cleared the lower level with slow, methodical steps. Moving past the scattered groceries, they observed dark, smeared stains across the flooring. But the most alarming element in the kitchen was the stovetop. All 4 dials were turned to the off position, but a massive, heavy-gauge stainless steel stockpot sat squarely on the back burner. The metal was still radiating intense heat from the recently extinguished flame. The lid was secured. The chemical odor was overwhelmingly concentrated right there. The officers documented the scene without disturbing the vessel, their rigorous training overriding the visceral human instinct to uncover it. They had absolutely no idea that mere inches from their gloved hands, submerged in a corrosive liquid slurry, rested the matriarch of the household. The sheer psychological weight of the environment pressed down on them. They moved cautiously toward the central stairwell, their flashlights illuminating heavy, wide drag marks etched deeply into the carpet fibers. The temperature climbed even higher as they ascended to the second floor. The dog's barking grew frantic, echoing from behind a closed guest room door. The hallway carpet was soaked with deep, rust-colored stains. The officers breached the upstairs exercise room. The walls were abstract canvases of arterial spray. Expensive workout equipment was overturned and shattered. It was the undeniable epicenter of a massive kinetic struggle to the death. Following the primary blood trail down the corridor, the deputies reached the master bathroom. The door was ajar. Inside, the heat reached its zenith. 2 portable electric space heaters were running at maximum capacity, aimed directly at the center of the tiled floor. Resting under the harsh thermal glare were 2 45-gallon plastic storage bins. The thick polyethylene walls were actively warping, buckling, and melting from the extreme thermal and chemical pressure generating inside. A highly corrosive liquid bubbled aggressively within the sealed containers. Resting on the floor near the base of the bins, completely detached from their host, were a pair of human hands. The deputies immediately backed out. They did not attempt to open the melting bins. They did not return to the kitchen to lift the stockpot lid. The scale of the atrocity vastly exceeded standard patrol protocols. They retreated to the front lawn, violently gasping for cold, fresh air, and radioed for a specialized hazmat unit and the Major Crimes Division. Within an hour, Golden View Lane was flooded with emergency vehicles, heavy armored trucks, and layers of yellow crime scene tape. The neighborhood woke up from its post-holiday lethargy to an absolute nightmare. Local residents stood on their manicured lawns in shock, watching men clad in heavy, encapsulated chemical suits entering the quiet brick house. Rumors ignited instantly. The community, accustomed to minor property damage and traffic citations, was paralyzed by the realization that an act of cartel-level butchery had occurred right next door. The social echo was immediate, a collective, terrified whisper regarding what could possibly require a full-scale hazardous materials response in a quiet retirement home. The Knox County Regional Forensic Center had never deployed for a residential call of this magnitude. When specialized hazardous materials teams finally breached the Golden View Lane property, they did not enter a standard crime scene. They entered an active, highly volatile chemical environment. Clad in heavy encapsulated Level A protective suits with self-contained breathing apparatuses, the technicians had to physically vent the structure before standard homicide investigators could even step through the front door. The ambient heat had baked the toxic vapor deep into the drywall, the carpets, and the ceiling tiles. Industrial fans were positioned at the entryways, pushing the lethal miasma of vaporized acid and decomposing tissue out into the cold November air. Only then could the grim work of processing the interior begin. The primary objective was neutralizing the ongoing destruction of forensic evidence. The heavy-duty plastic bins in the master bathroom were structurally failing, the synthetic walls weeping and bubbling under the intense thermal and chemical load. Hazmat technicians utilized specialized chemical-resistant pumps to carefully siphon the corrosive slurry away from the human remains trapped inside. Downstairs, the stainless steel stockpot on the kitchen stove was documented, photographed, and carefully removed from the burner. Seasoned forensic pathologists, Men and women who had spent decades cataloging fatal accidents, gang violence, and extreme trauma were forced to step outside the perimeter multiple times to physically collect themselves. The sheer mechanical degradation of the human form was completely alien to the quiet, affluent suburb. The immediate investigative hurdle was establishing a viable motive. The staggering savagery of the dismemberment strongly suggested a message killing, the kind of extreme theatrical violence typically associated with organized crime syndicates or targeted cartel hits. Detectives scoured the perimeter for signs of forced entry, broken deadbolts, or shattered window glass. They found nothing. The doors had been locked from the inside. Furthermore, the victim's youngest child was completely unaccounted for. His vehicle was missing from the driveway. His phone was inactive. For a brief, frantic period, a working theory emerged that an external hit squad had ambushed the home, slaughtered the parents, and abducted the son as a hostage. The neighborhood was paralyzed by this narrative. Rumors spread like wildfire across local social media networks, generating a palpable atmosphere of terror among the residents. Doors were deadbolted, security systems were armed. The idea that a professional kill team was operating in their quiet streets fundamentally shattered the community's illusion of safety. That cartel theory disintegrated the moment crime scene technicians began processing the second-floor guest bedroom. The space was mostly empty, save for a few discarded items and an abandoned backpack resting near the bed. Inside that canvas bag, investigators discovered a simple, spiral-bound collegiate notebook. It did not contain academic notes or medical school study guides. It was a comprehensive, step-by-step operational blueprint for mass murder. Detectives opened the notebook to find pages of highly organized, bulleted lists written in neat, deliberate handwriting. The entries detailed a terrifyingly clinical agenda. The writer had outlined the exact supplies needed, specifically noting the requirement to purchase heavy carving knives and a sledgehammer to systematically crush bones. The notebook contained precise, methodical instructions on how to flood the house with specific chemicals to destroy forensic evidence. There were explicit reminders to flush smaller biological fragments down the toilets to clear the drains, and a direct command to turn the home's thermostat up to 90 degrees to artificially accelerate the chemical decomposition. Most damning of all, the pages included detailed financial calculations. The author had meticulously tallied the exact value of the parents' life insurance policies, their retirement savings accounts, and the projected equity from the imminent sale of the Golden View house. The assets belonged to the victims. The handwriting belonged to their missing son. The paradigm of the entire investigation shifted in an instant. The son was not a hostage. He was not a secondary victim. He was the apex predator. The notebook proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the extreme violence was not a crime of passion or a sudden psychotic break. It was a cold, deeply premeditated financial transaction. The suspect had simply miscalculated the sheer physical endurance required to dismantle two adult bodies alongside the structural integrity of plastic storage bins. The deep lacerations sustained during the desperate defensive struggle with his father had forced him to abandon the cleanup and flee the state. Knox County authorities immediately pivoted from a rescue operation to a multi-state manhunt. Arrest warrants for 2 counts of first-degree murder were expedited. Detectives contacted the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, transmitting the suspect's vehicle information, license plate, and his last known residential address. By Monday evening, a covert surveillance net was draped over the apartment complex in Louisiana. Plainclothes federal agents and tactical units monitored the perimeter, watching the suspect's vehicle sitting quietly in the parking lot. They waited through the night, maintaining absolute radio silence. The resolution arrived on Tuesday morning, November 29th. The suspect exited his Baton Rouge apartment, walking methodically toward his car. He was not rushing. He did not check his blind spots or look over his shoulder. He moved with the exact same detached, robotic lethargy that had defined his entire adult life. Tactical teams converged from multiple blind angles, flooding the parking lot and boxing in his vehicle. As armed agents surrounded him, demanding his immediate compliance, he offered absolutely no resistance. He did not ask why he was being detained. He did not feign ignorance or ask about the safety of his family back in Tennessee. He simply raised his arms to surrender. The arresting officers immediately noted that both of his hands were heavily wrapped in thick, white medical bandages. His face remained a completely blank, emotionless mask, devoid of fear, surprise, or remorse. The architect of the Golden View Lane nightmare had been secured. September 2020. The Knox County courtroom was utterly silent as the prosecution meticulously unveiled the contents of the notebook. The jury was forced to view the unredacted crime scene photographs, the melted bins, the corrosive damage, the sheer mechanical butchery. Through it all, the defendant sat at the table like a marble statue. He exhibited absolutely no physical reaction. There were no tears, no lowered head in shame, no sudden outbursts of denial. Even as forensic pathologists detailed the exact methodology used to dismantle the people who had given him life, his expression remained entirely vacant. He occasionally scribbled notes on a legal pad, completely detached from the gravity of the proceedings. The defense had virtually nothing to work with. The physical evidence was insurmountable, and the financial motive was explicitly documented in his own handwriting. It took the jury less than 3 hours to reach a consensus. The verdict was unanimous. He was found guilty on all counts of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The presiding judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty allowable: 2 consecutive life sentences. The financial transaction he had so methodically planned resulted in a permanent, concrete cage. The tragedy of the Golden View Lane murders lies in the profound, twisted paradox of the motive. Joel and Lisa did not perish because they were neglectful, abusive, or absent. They were slaughtered entirely because they cared too much. Their final mistake was an act of deep parental love, a desperate attempt to finally push a dependent child toward a self-sufficient life. In return, they raised their own executioner, a man whose only response to independence was total annihilation. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. A 911 dispatcher takes a call that violates the most basic laws of nature. A mother reports finding her 8-year-old son and 4-year-old daughter hanging from a single wire dog lead in her basement. The operator desperately instructs her to cut them down, every passing second eroding their vanishing chance of survival. The mother flatly refuses. She claims she is too anxious. She tells dispatch she might somehow injure herself. 2 children are suffocating, and their sole protector just stands there, watching. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Albany Township, located in the northern reaches of Berks County, Pennsylvania, is defined by its vast stretches of working farmland, rolling hills, and winding 2-lane asphalt roads. Positioned roughly halfway between Allentown and Reading, the township is sparsely populated. Houses here do not sit shoulder to shoulder in neat subdivisions. Instead, they occupy multi-acre plots, separated by deep tracts of timber and sprawling cornfields. This geographical layout inherently breeds privacy. Residents mind their own business, waving from the cabs of passing trucks, but rarely scrutinizing what happens behind their neighbors' closed doors. It is an environment where isolation is the default, a geographic feature that perfectly insulates domestic dysfunction from outside intervention. The residents on Route 143 fit seamlessly into this rural tapestry. It was a modest, aging structure, showing obvious signs of deferred maintenance. The exterior was weathered, the yard perpetually unkempt. Inside, the reality of the occupants' lives was immediately apparent. The living spaces were overwhelmingly cluttered, a physical manifestation of a chaotic household. The main floor was cramped with overflowing boxes and the general detritus of a family barely scraping by. Below the main living area sat an unfinished basement, a dank, dimly lit concrete bunker used strictly for storage. It smelled of damp earth and stagnant air. It was decidedly not a place for children to play. 36-year-old Lisa Snyder commanded this environment. To the casual observer and her digital audience, she aggressively projected the persona of an exhausted but deeply devoted single mother. Raising 3 children on a limited income in a remote location is an objective hardship, and she weaponized this reality to cultivate sympathy. Her social media presence was a steady stream of updates highlighting her daily struggles, financial woes, and her supposedly fierce protective instinct over her kids. She demanded validation and pity, constructing a brittle psychological facade that masked a profound, chilling apathy. The primary subjects of her online narrative were her 2 youngest children, 8-year-old Connor and 4-year-old Brinley. Brinley was an affectionate, dependent toddler who closely shadowed her older brother. Connor was a gentle 3rd grader whose life was heavily dictated by severe physical and developmental challenges. He carried extra weight and suffered from significant motor skill deficits. His physical coordination was demonstrably poor. His manual dexterity was so underdeveloped that he required constant assistance with fundamental childhood tasks. He could barely manage the intricate finger movements necessary to tie his own shoelaces. This documented, undeniable lack of physical capability was a tragic reality of his daily routine, and it would soon become the central, damning piece of evidence to shatter his mother's fabricated alibi. Sharing the cramped space was Lisa's 17-year-old son. He functioned as a ghost within his own home. Like many teenagers trapped in a toxic environment, he engaged in self-preservation through total withdrawal. He spent the vast majority of his time retreated behind his bedroom door, isolating himself from the erratic emotional temperature of his mother and the constant demands of his younger siblings. He was physically present but emotionally detached, an involuntary observer to a domestic situation quietly accelerating toward a violent breaking point. The friction between the expansive, open landscape of Berks County and the suffocating reality inside the house on Route 143 was absolute. Behind the peeling paint and cluttered windows, financial desperation and emotional neglect festered under the absolute control of a woman whose maternal instincts had completely inverted. The community saw a beleaguered mother fighting to keep her family afloat, utterly unaware that the greatest threat to Connor and Brinley was the very person responsible for keeping them alive. The interior life of the Snyder household was a paradox of extreme isolation and carefully curated digital overexposure. Lisa Snyder operated within a self-constructed echo chamber to the outside world, accessed entirely through the glow of her smartphone. She was a martyr. She meticulously crafted a narrative of victimhood, presenting herself to online acquaintances as a woman crushed by the insurmountable pressures of poverty, single motherhood, and the relentless demands of a child with special needs. This digital avatar garnered sympathy, validation, and a twisted form of social currency. Yet, when the screen went dark, the performance abruptly ended. Behind the heavy wooden doors of her Route 143 home, the maternal warmth vanished. It was replaced by a chilling, pervasive apathy. The children were not subjects of affection. They were viewed as liabilities, living, breathing obstacles interfering with her autonomy. This severe disconnect between public projection and private reality was not a sudden development. The structural decay of the family possessed a documented institutional history. In the fall of 2014, Berks County Children and Youth Services executed an intervention that should have served as a permanent severing of her parental rights. Caseworkers responding to a local tip did not find a home merely struggling with economic hardship. They uncovered an environment of profound, dangerous neglect. The floors were coated in filth, the air was thick with the stench of animal waste, and basic medical and hygienic care was non-existent. Connor, then a vulnerable toddler, alongside his older brother, was immediately removed from her custody. The state recognized the imminent threat and placed the boys in protective foster care. For a brief window of time, the system functioned as designed. The children experienced a stable, sanitized environment. However, the bureaucratic machinery of family court often prioritizes biological reunification over objective, long-term safety. After completing a mandated series of parenting classes and demonstrating a superficial, temporary improvement in her living conditions, Lisa regained full custody in early 2015. Brinley was born shortly thereafter. The return was a death sentence delayed. The initial compliance forced by the courts quickly eroded. Without the constant, looming gaze of caseworkers, the household rapidly regressed into its former state of squalor and emotional starvation. The 2014 intervention did not rehabilitate her maternal instincts. It merely taught her how to better hide her dysfunction from institutional oversight. Connor bore the heaviest physical and psychological weight of this toxic regression. His challenges extended far beyond the typical academic struggles of a third grader. He required a strict individualized education program to navigate a basic curriculum. His developmental delays were stark and undeniable. He walked with a heavy, uncoordinated gait. Tasks requiring fine motor skills presented insurmountable barriers. He could not manipulate the metal clasps on his own winter coat or exert the hand strength required to twist open a sealed plastic bottle. He was a boy who required profound patient support, the exact antithesis of what his mother was willing to provide. Instead of fostering his development, she exploited his vulnerabilities. Months before the fatal incident, she began laying the groundwork for a sinister, fabricated narrative. She actively planted seeds with school administrators and extended family members, claiming that her son was the victim of relentless, severe bullying. She painted a grim picture of an 8-year-old so tormented by his peers that his mental health was fracturing. She told counselors that Connor hated school, that he was deeply depressed, and that he harbored dark, self-destructive ideations. This was a calculated, proactive projection. The district found zero evidence to corroborate her aggressive claims. Teachers, aides, and bus drivers reported a boy who, while facing immense physical hurdles, was generally cheerful, resilient, and well-liked by his classmates. The darkness she described did not originate from the elementary school playground. It emanated entirely from her own mind. While Connor was the focal point of her psychological manipulation, 4-year-old Brinley was simply caught in the gravitational pull of her mother's resentment. The toddler was affectionate, entirely dependent, and blissfully unaware of the tension saturating the house. She shadowed her older brother everywhere he went, a fierce sibling loyalty that would ultimately ensure they shared the exact same fate. By the late summer of 2019, the economic and social claustrophobia of her existence reached a critical mass. The financial strain was absolute. Her oldest son, navigating his own teenage turmoil behind a locked bedroom door, offered no emotional harbor. She was trapped in a rural prison of her own making, surrounded by acres of empty Pennsylvania farmland that only amplified her isolation. The transition from chronic neglect to active malice was a quiet internal shift. She did not exhibit the erratic, explosive behavior typical of a sudden psychological break. Instead, her actions grew methodical. The apathy hardened into a cold, transactional logic. She began viewing her dependents not as human beings requiring care, but as localized problems requiring a permanent solution. It was the culmination of years of institutional failure, profound selfishness, and a total catastrophic collapse of human empathy. September 23, 2019. The weather across eastern Pennsylvania was unseasonably warm, a mild and quiet early autumn afternoon. At Greenwich-Lenhartsville Elementary School, the final bell signaled the end of the academic day. Connor navigated the crowded hallways and boarded his usual yellow school bus for the long ride back to the rural stretches of Route 143. Security cameras mounted above the driver's seat captured his exact demeanor during the transit. He was not crying. He was not withdrawn, trembling, or exhibiting any signs of trauma. The grainy color footage showed an 8-year-old boy smiling, interacting casually with his peers across the aisle, and staring out the window at the passing acres of harvested cornfields. He exhibited absolutely zero evidence of the profound psychological distress and active suicidal ideation his mother had so loudly broadcasted to the district administration. He was simply a child heading home for the afternoon. The heavy vehicle ground to a halt at the edge of his gravel driveway shortly after 2:40 p.m. The hydraulic doors hissed open. Connor stepped down onto the shoulder of the road, visibly struggling to adjust the straps of his heavy backpack due to his documented lack of fine motor skills. He turned, walked up the long driveway toward the weathered exterior of his house, and disappeared inside. It was the last time the outside world would see him conscious. What unfolded inside the residence between the moment the front door clicked shut at 2:40 p.m. and the initial emergency dispatch at 4:33 p.m. remains a timeline entirely controlled by the perpetrator. The physical layout of the home is critical to understanding the mechanics of the horror that followed. The 17-year-old son was upstairs, secured behind his closed bedroom door with his headphones firmly over his ears, effectively isolated from the auditory landscape of the rest of the house. Lisa was downstairs with Connor and 4-year-old Brinley. The main floor of the cluttered home gave way to an unfinished basement, a subterranean space accessible only by a narrow, steep flight of hollow wooden stairs. Sometime during this unaccounted 90-minute window, a complex lethal mechanism was constructed in the damp, windowless gloom below the floorboards. The main support beam of the basement ceiling ran horizontally across the center of the room, exposed and splintered. Over this thick timber, a single, black, heavy-duty wire dog lead was draped. The lead was exactly 3 feet long, coated in thick, weather-resistant plastic, and equipped with stiff, spring-loaded metal swivel clasps at both ends. Directly beneath the wooden beam, 2 heavy, high-backed dining room chairs were positioned side by side. The physical reality of this staging was fundamentally at odds with Connor's physical capabilities. The support beam was well over 7 feet off the ground, far out of his vertical reach. The wire dog lead required significant finger dexterity and grip strength to manipulate, loop over the timber, and secure tightly. The dining room chairs were bulky, weighted items that would need to be dragged from the upper floor kitchen, navigated around tight corners, and wrestled down a steep, treacherous flight of stairs. An 8-year-old boy who lacked the manual coordination to fasten his own winter coat, who could not exert the pressure required to pop the tab on a soda can or successfully tie his own shoelaces, could not have engineered this complex setup. He could not have carried those chairs down the steps. He definitively could not have hoisted his 40-pound sister into the air, secured a stiff metal clasp tightly around her throat, and then managed to do the exact same thing to his own neck, while maintaining the precise tension required for the single wire lid to function as a simultaneous double noose. It was an absolute mechanical and physiological impossibility. Yet the heavy chairs were eventually kicked over. The wire was pulled brutally taut. 2 small children were suspended in the dim, stale air of the basement, slowly asphyxiating in the silent house, while their mother remained entirely conscious and physically capable on the floor directly above them. At exactly 4:33 p.m., the heavy silence of the property was broken by an incoming call to the Berks County 911 dispatch center. Lisa's voice came through the line, eerily steady. She reported that she had just gone down to the basement to check on the kids, supposedly after noticing the house was too quiet, and found them hanging from the ceiling. The dispatcher, immediately recognizing the catastrophic, time-sensitive nature of the emergency, shifted into a mode of rapid, controlled urgency. He ordered her to physically lift the children to relieve the extreme pressure on their windpipes. He instructed her to grab a kitchen knife, a pair of heavy scissors, wire cutters, or anything sharp, and sever the lead immediately. Her response defied every known biological imperative and maternal instinct. She flatly refused to intervene. She claimed she was sweating too much. She told the operator her anxiety was suddenly spiking to debilitating levels. She argued that the dog lead was wrapped too tightly, and if she tried to lift their dead weight or cut the thick plastic-coated wire, she might accidentally injure them further or hurt herself in the process. The dispatcher's voice grew significantly louder, shedding protocol for raw human desperation, begging the mother to find a way, any way, to restore airflow to her children. She remained coldly anchored in her hollow excuses. She stayed on the line, actively narrating her own alleged panic, while the clock ticked mercilessly forward. Irreversible brain death from oxygen deprivation begins within 4 to 6 minutes. Every single second she spent arguing with dispatch was a second Connor and Brinley were actively dying. She did not scream for her strong teenage son upstairs to rush down and help lift the weight. She did not sprint to the kitchen for a carving knife. She simply stood back and waited for the inevitable. The emergency dispatch tones dropped across the northern sectors of Berks County. Heavy sirens shattered the quiet autumn afternoon. Pennsylvania state troopers and local volunteer paramedics pushed their fleet vehicles to the absolute mechanical limit, their tires violently gripping the winding 2-lane asphalt of Route 143. The first units breached the perimeter of the property within 8 minutes of the initial 911 call, an incredibly fast, aggressive response time for the sprawling rural jurisdiction. The scene they encountered upon kicking open the front door was a study in horrific, surreal contrasts. The mother was pacing, presenting as agitated but entirely unharmed, gesturing toward the basement door. The older brother finally emerged from his upstairs bedroom, completely bewildered by the sudden, violent invasion of uniformed personnel, having been completely oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded directly beneath his feet. First responders hit the basement stairs at a sprint. The air below grade was heavy, smelling of ancient dust and raw earth. Tactical flashlights swept the shadows, instantly locking onto the main beam. The paramedics and troopers did not hesitate. They did not experience the paralyzing anxiety the mother claimed had incapacitated her. A state trooper produced a heavy-duty tactical folding blade, stepped quickly onto the overturned wooden dining chairs, and forcefully sawed through the thick plastic-coated wire. The tension snapped. The children's limp bodies collapsed downward into the waiting, outstretched arms of the medics. Their physical condition was devastating. They were profoundly cyanotic. Their skin tinged a terrifying ashen blue from prolonged, catastrophic oxygen starvation. They were completely unresponsive to pain stimuli. Their pupils were fixed and dilated. There was zero spontaneous respiration. No palpable pulses could be found at the carotid or radial arteries. The cold concrete floor of the cluttered basement instantly transformed into an active, desperate trauma bay. Paramedics initiated aggressive, two-person cardiopulmonary resuscitation on both children simultaneously. The rhythmic, mechanical crunch of deep chest compressions echoed off the cinder block walls, a desperate cadence against the silence. Intravenous lines were rapidly drilled directly into the intraosseous tissue of their tiny, collapsing veins to push massive doses of epinephrine. The medics worked with a furious, highly controlled panic, refusing to accept the grim physiological reality of the timeline they had been handed. Outside the house, the deep, thumping hum of heavy rotors announced the arrival of two separate med-evac helicopters, touching down in a nearby clearing to avoid the power lines on Route 143. Inside, the frantic, exhausting efforts yielded a microscopic, fragile sliver of hope. Faint, thread-ready pulses were miraculously restored in both Connor and Brinley. They were not breathing on their own, and their neurological status remained a dark abyss, but their hearts were once again mechanically beating. The children were secured to rigid pediatric backboards, manually bagged with high-flow pure oxygen, and rushed up the narrow wooden stairs, bursting out into the blinding, indifferent light of the autumn afternoon. As the paramedics sprinted across the overgrown gravel yard toward the waiting flight crews, Lisa watched from the perimeter. She did not fight to ride in the back of the rig. She did not collapse in hysterics. She stood firmly on the driveway, surrounded by the flashing lights of state trooper cruisers, as the helicopters lifted off, carrying Connor and Brinley toward the pediatric intensive care unit at Lehigh Valley Hospital. The massive rotors chopped through the warm air, leaving behind an empty, silent house, a severed wire dog sled, and a mother who had already begun carefully rehearsing her alibi. The pediatric intensive care unit at Lehigh Valley Hospital offered no sanctuary. It was a sterile, hyper-illuminated environment dominated entirely by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of life support. The monitors above the beds tracked a grim, inescapable reality. Extensive neurological examinations quickly confirmed the absolute destruction of cerebral tissue. The period of oxygen starvation down in the basement had been far too severe, the delay in emergency intervention far too long. For 3 agonizing days, the siblings lay completely motionless, tethered to heavy ventilators, while the final, automatic functions of their bodies slowly began to shut down. In the adjacent waiting areas, the mother's behavior shattered every known psychological protocol of grief. She was not a broken woman clinging to the faint hope of a medical miracle. She was the hyper-vigilant architect of a rapidly crumbling alibi. She paced the polished hospital corridors, not desperately seeking updates from pediatric surgeons, but aggressively peddling a staggering, complex fiction to the detectives and social workers hovering nearby. She claimed the entire atrocity was a calculated murder-suicide orchestrated exclusively by her 8-year-old son. Her defense relied on a foundation of extreme, undocumented psychological torment. She insisted the boy had been the target of merciless daily bullying at his elementary school, that he was so fundamentally broken, so terrified of the harassment, that he had quietly decided to end his own life. The darkest, most unbelievable layer of her narrative was the inclusion of the 4-year-old. She told authorities the boy was simply too frightened to cross over into death alone, so he manipulated his toddler sister into joining him in the basement. The physiological and logistical impossibilities of this claim were glaring. A child of 8 does not possess the cognitive capacity to conceptualize, let alone negotiate, a suicide pact with a toddler. Furthermore, the physical mechanics of the crime scene entirely precluded his involvement. To believe her narrative meant accepting that a boy who could not operate the zipper on his own jacket had somehow secured an industrial-strength, plastic-coated wire tightly over a wooden beam 7 feet in the air. It meant believing he possessed the sheer, explosive physical force required to lift a struggling 40-pound girl, place her neck precisely within a rigid metal loop, and somehow maintain the exact tension necessary to asphyxiate both of them simultaneously. As the hours bled away in the ICU, she continued to construct her shield. She weaponized social media directly from the hospital lobby, leaning heavily into the digital persona she had cultivated for years. She painted herself as the ultimate tragic victim of a negligent school district, attempting to deflect the looming homicide investigation onto an invisible cabal of playground bullies. 50 miles away in Albany Township, the initial shockwave of the tragedy triggered an immediate, compassionate response. Rural communities instinctively close ranks during a sudden crisis. Vigils were organized in the crisp autumn air. Crowdfunding accounts were rapidly established by well-meaning locals to absorb the inevitable, crushing shock of medical and funeral costs. The collective heartache was palpable, driven by the incomprehensible image of 2 young siblings driven to such a dark, violent end. But as the mother's aggressive media campaign intensified, the local atmosphere completely curdled. Genuine sorrow rapidly mutated into deep, paranoid suspicion. The residents of the small town knew the family. The other parents knew the boy. They watched him on the morning bus. They saw him in the cafeteria. The community knew the reality. He was a gentle kid who loved video games, completely devoid of the dark, violent ideations his mother was now broadcasting to the world. School administrators and teachers quietly, but firmly, dismantled her claims in the background. They provided investigators with a pristine behavioral record. There were absolutely no reports of bullying. There were 0 disciplinary actions or signs of depression. The boy was well-liked and fiercely protected by his peers. The local rumor mill accelerated, buzzing through diners and hardware stores across Berks County. The red flags were impossible to ignore. Neighbors openly questioned the sudden appearance of the heavy-duty dog lead, a piece of thick, restrictive equipment entirely unsuited for the small, mixed-breed dog that actually lived on the property. And the most chilling detail, leaked from the initial emergency dispatch, began to circulate like poison. She had stood in the basement, fully capable of lifting them, and had flatly refused to intervene. On September 26, 2019, the ventilators were quietly shut down. The children were pronounced dead within minutes of each other. The immediate medical crisis concluded, but the criminal gears were now turning at full speed. State police investigators did not immediately place the mother in handcuffs. It was a calculated, tactical delay. They allowed her to return to her cluttered home, to keep talking, to keep posting, and to keep digging a hole she could never escape. Every fabricated detail she offered to the public was another nail in the coffin of her defense, giving detectives exactly the quiet time they needed to secure the digital forensics that would utterly destroy her. The investigative machinery of the Pennsylvania State Police operates on a strict doctrine of elimination. Before detectives could officially target the mother, they had to exhaustively dismantle her alibi. They had to hunt for a phantom. The initial phase of the inquiry was forced down a mandated red herring, a deep dive into the elementary school ecosystem to verify the claims of extreme fatal bullying. Investigators descended on the local school district, pulling years of administrative files, disciplinary records, and counseling logs. They interviewed playground monitors, cafeteria staff, and the transportation department. They scrutinized seating charts and cross-referenced behavioral reports. The result was a sprawling, documented void. There was absolutely zero evidence of harassment. Not a single teacher had witnessed an altercation. Not a single aide had reported a conflict. The boy had never filed a complaint, nor had any of his peers reported him being targeted. The analytical focus quickly revealed that the only human being in the entire state of Pennsylvania who had ever mentioned this severe bullying was the mother herself. Detectives mapped the timeline of her complaints and discovered a chilling pattern. She had not been reporting past incidents. She had been actively seeding a preemptive defense. She was laying down a paper trail of institutional concern weeks before she ever intended to use it, constructing a fictional motive for a murder she was quietly planning to execute. With the suicide pact theory completely debunked by the school district's records, the investigative lens snapped back to the cluttered house on Route 143. Crime scene technicians and forensic engineers occupied the basement, tasked with mathematically proving the physical impossibility of the staging. They measured the exact vertical drop from the splintered support beam to the concrete floor. They calculated the combined weight of the heavy wooden dining chairs and the required torque to tip them over. They analyzed the stiff, unyielding nature of the plastic-coated wire. The physics simply did not align with human anatomy. The forensic reconstruction definitively proved that the elaborate double noose mechanism required the height, leverage, and fine manual dexterity of a fully grown adult. The staging was a clumsy theatrical production, designed by someone who vastly overestimated the believability of their own lie. The physical weapon itself provided the next critical fracture in her facade. Detectives seized the black wire dog lead and traced its origins. It was not a forgotten piece of hardware resting in a dusty garage corner. It was a brand new acquisition. Financial records led investigators to a local pet supply store, where transaction logs confirmed the purchase was made just 24 hours before the emergency dispatch. The specifications of the cable were damning. The packaging indicated it was a heavy-duty model, engineered with industrial steel and rated to hold an animal weighing up to 250 pounds. The family did own a dog, a husky mix, but the animal weighed barely 50 pounds and spent its time roaming freely indoors or on a lightweight fabric leash. The heavy, rigid wire was vastly disproportionate to any legitimate pet care need. It was bought for a highly specific, sinister utility. While the physical evidence was cementing the parameters of a double homicide, the digital forensics unit was preparing to deliver the terminal blow. Armed with search warrants, cybercrime specialists extracted the encrypted data from her seized smartphone. The server logs and cached history did not reveal a grieving mother blindsided by a sudden tragedy. The device was a clear, chronological roadmap of premeditated slaughter. Her internet search history exposed a shifting methodology of murder. In the weeks leading up to the autumn afternoon, her queries were highly specific and clinically detached. She had aggressively searched for information on how long it takes to die from carbon monoxide poisoning inside a sealed vehicle. She was actively shopping for the most efficient, untraceable mechanism to eliminate her dependents. When the vehicular exhaust method apparently proved too logistically complex, her digital footprint shifted toward asphyxiation. The cyber timeline grew increasingly darker as the fatal date approached. The extraction software recovered her streaming history, highlighting a bizarre and arrogant psychological profile. In the days directly preceding the basement staging, she had spent hours binge-watching true crime documentary programming. Her viewing logs showed repeated engagement with a television series focused entirely on fugitives and botched investigations, specifically episodes detailing how criminals attempted to evade forensic detection. She was not consuming media for entertainment. She was studying police procedure, hunting for investigative blind spots she could exploit to sell her fabricated murder-suicide narrative. The final absolute destruction of her maternal persona was found hidden within her social messaging applications. Detectives pulled the chat transcripts from the exact window of time she claimed her children were experiencing a profound, fatal psychological crisis. The contrast was staggering. While the complex wire mechanism was being constructed below the floorboards, she was actively engaged in a casual, highly explicit digital exchange. Just hours before dialing emergency services, She was messaging a man, complaining about the general annoyances of her daily routine, and transmitting sexually explicit photographs of herself. Her tone was completely unbothered, a chilling exhibition of normalcy, while an unimaginable atrocity was actively unfolding in the damp shadows of her own home. The district attorney's office reviewed the cascading avalanche of proof. They possessed the forensic reconstruction that defied the laws of physics. They had the retail receipts for the murder weapon. They held the digital logs proving premeditation, research, and a profound lack of emotional distress. The tactical delay had served its purpose. Law enforcement had allowed her to talk, post, and lie for 2 months, giving her enough rope to completely hang her own defense. In late November, the waiting period officially ended. State troopers arrived at her current location, bypassing the polite inquiries of the previous weeks. She was placed in rigid steel handcuffs, formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and stripped of the victim narrative she had spent years so carefully curating. The judicial reckoning was a protracted, multi-year process. It wasn't until September 2024 that the Berks County Courthouse finally addressed the charges. Opting for a bench trial, the defense bypassed a jury entirely, leaving the final judgment solely to Judge Teresa Johnson. The prosecution's presentation was surgical. They laid out the mechanical impossibility of the basement staging, the retail receipts for the heavy-duty wire lead, and the damning timeline of her internet searches. But the most devastating blow came from within the bloodline. The surviving son, now a young adult, took the stand. He methodically described the reality of the home environment, the timeline of that autumn afternoon, and the absolute lack of bullying surrounding his younger brother. His testimony permanently eradicated the final, desperate fragments of the fabricated suicide pact. Judge Johnson required very little time to deliberate. She returned a swift, unequivocal verdict of guilty on all charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. A month later, in October 2024, the sentencing phase delivered a terminal conclusion. The court mandated 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. There would be no leniency, no mitigating circumstances acknowledged. The architect of the tragedy was permanently exiled to the state penitentiary system, locked in a concrete cell where she could no longer project a false reality. The iron doors of the penitentiary have closed, but true justice in this case remains a fractured illusion. A sentence of life without parole cannot restore the stolen futures suffocated in that damp, unfinished basement. The defining terror here is not the mechanical staging of the crime itself. It is the absolute perversion of the maternal instinct. Connor and Brinley deserved a quiet life defined by safety and compassion, not a calculated execution administered by the one person nature assigned to protect them. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. February 14th, 2018. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. The corridors are filled with Valentine's Day balloons and the restless energy of the final bell. Then, the deafening rhythmic crack of a legally purchased AR-15 shatters the afternoon. The most terrifying aspect of this massacre isn't just the sheer brutality, it's the immediate aftermath. The shooter doesn't take his own life. He doesn't engage in a final stand with police. Instead, he drops his rifle on a stairwell, blends into a terrified crowd of fleeing teenagers, and casually walks to a nearby McDonald's for a drink, leaving a war zone behind him. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Parkland, Florida is the kind of suburban enclave designed specifically to keep the world's ugliness at bay. Tucked away on the edge of the Everglades, it boasts meticulously manicured lawns, gated communities, and a median household income that dwarfs the national average. It is a place defined by its safety, an affluent bubble where parents relocate primarily to secure a spot for their children in the highly rated public school system. Violent crime here wasn't just rare, it was practically a foreign concept. Within this meticulously structured environment, the Cruz household was a stark anomaly. It was a pressure cooker of escalating dysfunction hidden behind a standard suburban facade. Born in the fall of 1998, the boy and his biological half-brother were adopted as infants by Roger and Linda Cruz. Initially, the family presented a picture of domestic normalcy, but the foundation cracked early. When the perpetrator was just 5 years old, Roger suffered a fatal heart attack. Linda was suddenly a single mother, left to manage 2 growing boys, one of whom was already displaying deeply concerning behavioral aberrations. The signs of profound psychological decay did not materialize overnight. They began in early childhood and metastasized year by year. Teachers and neighbors noted an unrelenting pattern of aggression. There were unprovoked attacks on other children, instances of biting, hitting, and an absolute inability to regulate basic emotions. Clinical evaluations yielded a dense file of diagnoses: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, developmental delays, and oppositional defiant disorder. Later assessments would point towards severe depression and traits associated with the autism spectrum. He was heavily medicated, cycling through various psychiatric prescriptions, yet the core volatility remained completely untouched. Linda struggled immensely. She cared for her adopted son, but was fundamentally unequipped to handle his explosive rages. As he grew physically larger, the power dynamic in the home shifted dangerously. The teenager began to terrorize his mother. The interior of their home reflected this chaos, with holes punched through the drywall and shattered belongings littering the floors. Law enforcement became a permanent fixture at their residence. Over a span of roughly a decade, deputies responded to the house dozens of times for domestic disturbances, varying from throwing heavy objects to outright physical assaults on Linda. Beyond the domestic violence, a much darker pathology was taking root: a relentless fascination with inflicting pain. Neighborhood reports detailed incidents of extreme animal cruelty. He used a pellet gun to shoot at local wildlife, attempted to drown animals in the family pool, and openly expressed a desire to kill. These weren't the simple missteps of a troubled youth. They were the clinical red flags of an emerging sociopath. Yet each incident was treated in isolation by the authorities. The school system, mental health professionals, and local deputies repeatedly encountered a highly disturbed individual, but the overarching threat was never fully synthesized. To manage his disruptive presence, the district frequently transferred him between alternative behavioral centers and mainstream classrooms. It was a bureaucratic shuffle that prioritized temporary containment over long-term intervention. He was a known entity to everyone: school resource officers, counselors, and local police. He was the student who brought knives to campus hidden in his lunchbox, the one who openly researched combat gear on school computers, the one who made classmates so deeply uncomfortable they frequently remarked to one another that he would be the one to eventually shoot up the school. The environment surrounding him was saturated with blaring warnings. His psychological profile wasn't a closely guarded secret uncovered by detectives after the fact. It was broadcast openly to an entire community. The tragedy of his development was not a sudden psychological break. It was a slow, agonizingly visible descent into extreme violence, happening in plain sight under the warm Florida sun. By the time the teenager enrolled at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the friction between his deeply disturbed psyche and the structured academic environment was absolute. The campus, sprawling and populated by over 3,000 students, offered endless targets for his unfocused aggression. Inside the classrooms, his presence was a constant source of profound unease. Fellow students reported him selling knives out of a lunchbox. He brought spent bullet casings to school, openly displaying them to peers in the hallways. His homework assignments were frequently defaced with racial slurs and hateful extremist iconography. Administrators responded with a revolving door of disciplinary actions. Suspensions piled up. He was strictly banned from bringing a backpack to campus, forced to carry his belongings in clear plastic bags. The system attempted to manage the threat by repeatedly shuffling him to an off-site behavioral center, only to reintegrate him back into the main student body when his term ended. This administrative cycle continued until early 2017, when a physical altercation over an ex-girlfriend finally triggered his formal expulsion from the district. But expelling a threat does not neutralize it. It merely removes it from the administration's immediate line of sight. Removed from the daily constraints of school, the 19-year-old retreated entirely into a dark digital echo chamber. His online footprint evolved into a glaring neon sign of impending mass violence. He created social media profiles dedicated exclusively to his arsenal. Pictures surfaced showing him holding various blades, brandishing firearms, and displaying mutilated animals. The rhetoric accompanying these images was steeped in violent racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. The digital bleeding soon crossed into real-world warnings. A bail bondsman in Mississippi flagged a YouTube comment posted from an account bearing the teenager's exact name. The message stated a clear, unambiguous goal: to become a professional school shooter. The FBI was notified. Agents conducted a preliminary assessment, but the tip was ultimately closed and filed away in a database due to an alleged inability to positively identify the author. Later, another caller contacted a designated FBI tip line, explicitly warning that the boy possessed an arsenal, exhibited severe psychological distress, and was actively planning to attack a school. Protocol dictated the information be routed directly to the Miami field office. It never was. This systemic blindness extended to local law enforcement. Despite deputies responding to the family home on numerous occasions, intervening in violent domestic disputes, and documenting threats of self-harm, the teenager was never involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation under the state's Baker Act. That single bureaucratic omission proved fatal. Without a documented psychiatric hold or a felony conviction, his legal background check remained perfectly clean. On February 11th, 2017, just a few weeks after turning 18, he walked into a local tactical supply store in Coral Springs. He presented a valid identification card, filled out the required federal forms, and passed the instant background check without a single red flag. He legally purchased a Smith & Wesson .380 and P15 semi-automatic rifle. The transaction was entirely seamless. Over the subsequent months, he legally accumulated a small arsenal, a shotgun, additional rifles, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He also acquired a tactical vest, an accessory designed strictly to carry heavy loads of magazines, ensuring he could sustain a high rate of fire without pausing. The tools of mass casualty were obtained with terrifying bureaucratic ease. Then, the final tether to society snapped. In November 2017, Linda Cruz succumbed to complications from pneumonia. The mother who had frantically tried to manage his volatile existence for nearly 2 decades was gone. The teenager was effectively orphaned. He briefly relocated to a mobile home park with a family friend, before being taken in by the Sneed family, whose son he knew from school. The Sneeds offered him a spare room, believing they were helping a grieving young man find his footing. They helped him secure a low-wage job at a local discount store. To them, he appeared quiet, perhaps a bit odd, but compliant. They established strict house rules, primarily regarding his weapons. He was required to keep his firearms securely locked inside a metal gun safe in his bedroom. He readily agreed to the terms, but the illusion of safety was paper thin. He retained the only key to the lockbox. Under their roof, while going to his mundane retail job by day, he was finalizing a massacre by night. In the weeks leading up to mid-February, his isolation crystallized into absolute, calculated intent. He began using his cell phone to record video manifestos, speaking directly to the camera in the quiet confines of his bedroom. He introduced himself, outlined his exact plan to return to his former high school, and estimated his projected body count. There was no visible rage in his demeanor, only a hollow, detached anticipation. He bragged about the notoriety he would inevitably achieve. He meticulously detailed the logistics, the ride-share drop-off, the tactical approach to the freshman building, the element of surprise. The recordings captured a mind completely untethered from human empathy, treating the impending slaughter as a grand theatrical debut. The storm had fully gathered. All that remained was execution. The afternoon of February 14th begins with mundane precision. At 2:06 p.m., a hired driver pulls up to the Sneed residence. The passenger waiting on the curb carries a heavy, dark duffel bag and a backpack. He climbs into the vehicle. During the short ride, he remains entirely silent, staring out the window. The driver later noted to authorities that her passenger simply looked like an ordinary teenager struggling with an oversized music case or sports gear. There is no tension in his posture, no nervous twitching, just cold, vacant anticipation. At 2:19 p.m., the car approaches the sprawling campus of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. The drop-off point is just steps from the gates. He exits the vehicle and walks with deliberate, measured steps toward Building 12. Building 12 is a massive 3-story cinder block structure primarily housing freshmen. It is designed with long, straight corridors and enclosed stairwells at either end, a fatal architectural funnel. As he crosses the perimeter, the first catastrophic layer of security failure occurs. An unarmed campus monitor spots him approaching. The monitor instantly recognizes the young man. He knows this is the expelled student who had explicitly threatened the school, the one staff had been formally warned about. The monitor radios a colleague to report the sighting, but he does not utter the 2 words that would instantly lock down the entire campus. Code red. The hesitation allows the perpetrator to pull open the heavy doors of the east stairwell uncontested. He slips inside the concrete enclosure. He unzips the dark duffel bag, extracts the Smith & Wesson M and P15. He methodically loads the weapon and slips the heavy tactical vest over his shoulders. His pockets and pouches are weighed down with extra magazines. The preparation is entirely unhurried. A freshman student pushes open the stairwell door, stumbling directly into the preparations. The perpetrator glances up, his face completely devoid of emotion. He advises the boy to leave immediately, stating that things are about to get bad. The terrified student turns and sprints down the hall, desperate to find a teacher. But time has run out. It is exactly 2:21 p.m. The heavy stairwell door swings open onto the first-floor corridor. The pacing shifts. He raises the rifle. The first shots tear through the air. The sound is absolute and apocalyptic. In the enclosed cinder block hallway, the concussive blasts of the AR-15 echo with brain-rattling intensity. He does not kick down doors. He does not engage in close quarters room clearing. The classroom doors are locked, but each features a narrow pane of glass. It is a fatal design flaw. He simply walks down the center of the corridor, turning his weapon toward the windows of rooms 1215, 1216, 1214, and 1213. He fires continuously. The high-velocity rounds shatter the glass, shred the metal frames, and punch effortlessly through the thick drywall. Inside the classrooms, the reality is pure horror. Students scramble under desks, pressing themselves against the cold linoleum, trying to shrink into the floorboards. The corridor fills with an impenetrable, choking fog of white drywall dust and gray gun smoke. The sharp, metallic scent of copper and burning cordite saturates the air. The heavy accumulation of particles reaches the sensors on the ceiling. The sirens trigger. The strobe lights begin to flash violently through the dust. The piercing, rhythmic blare of the fire alarm creates a catastrophic secondary crisis. Decades of ingrained school conditioning take over. Students and teachers on the 2nd and 3rd floors, unable to clearly distinguish the muffled gunfire from the deafening alarm, assume there is a fire. They follow protocol. They unlock their doors. They step out of their secure classrooms and begin to flood into the exposed hallways. They are walking directly into a kill zone. Down below, the shooter circles back. He retraces his steps, firing a second time into the classrooms to target anyone who has shifted from their initial hiding spot. His gait is terrifyingly casual. He walks, pauses, aims, and fires. At 2:24 p.m., he pushes through the heavy doors into the west stairwell and begins his ascent. He reaches the 2nd floor. The corridor is mostly empty. A quick-thinking staff member here had recognized the distinct rhythmic popping of semi-automatic gunfire over the wail of the fire alarm. They managed to enforce a rapid lockdown just seconds before the perpetrator emerged. He fires into room 1234. The rounds shatter the window, but the students are huddled deep in the hard corners of the room, completely out of his line of sight. He assesses the empty hallway. He does not linger. He turns back to the stairwell and climbs higher. At 2:25 p.m., he steps onto the 3rd floor. The scene is absolute, unfiltered chaos. The fire alarm had fully mobilized this level. The long, narrow corridor is packed with confused teenagers and faculty. As the shooter emerges from the stairwell, the crowd realizes the horrifying truth. Panic erupts. The hallway offers zero physical cover. It is a straight, concrete tunnel. Teachers scream for the kids to turn back. They shove students back toward the classrooms. But the doors, which lock automatically from the outside, have clicked shut behind them. Faculty members fumble with lanyards and keys with shaking hands, desperate to swing open the heavy wooden barriers as the shooter raises his rifle. He fires straight down the corridor. The staccato blasts are relentless. Students drop to the floor. Teachers physically throw themselves over the teenagers, using their own bodies to absorb the high-velocity rounds. The sheer kinetic energy of the 5.56 ammunition means a single bullet effortlessly tears through multiple targets. Behind locked doors, terrified students huddle in the dark. Dispatchers at the county emergency center are completely overwhelmed. Operators struggle to decipher the whispered, frantic pleas of teenagers begging for police, reporting that the shooter is standing right outside their door. The 911 lines are a cacophony of sobbing, blaring alarms and the distant, rhythmic crack of the rifle. The perpetrator advances past the carnage. He reaches the teacher's lounge at the far end of the hall. He spots the large exterior windows overlooking the central campus courtyard below. His behavior shifts. He attempts to adapt his strategy. He raises the rifle and fires directly at the window, intending to shatter it and establish a sniper position to rain fire down on the fleeing masses outside the building. The glass cracks, spiderwebbing violently, but it does not break. It is hurricane impact glass. Reinforced with heavy polymer webbing, it absorbs the rounds and holds firm. He fires again. The window bows, but refuses to shatter. His sniper nest is compromised. He turns back toward the main hallway. He moves to insert a fresh magazine. The weapon jams. The feeding mechanism seizes. He forcefully racks the bolt, trying to clear the chamber. The rifle remains locked. He stands in the smoky, flashing hallway and stares at the jammed weapon. The mechanical failure breaks his rhythm. The adrenaline of the assault seems to instantly evaporate. The theatricality of his plan dissolves into a sudden, cowardly realization of his own vulnerability. It is exactly 2:27 p.m. The entire massacre has lasted just under 6 minutes. He makes a rapid, calculated pivot. He ejects the jammed magazine. He unbuckles the heavy tactical vest and lets it fall to the blood-slicked linoleum. He drops the AR-15 on the landing of the stairwell. In a matter of seconds, he completely sheds the identity of an active shooter. He morphs back into an anonymous, unassuming teenager. He pushes through the stairwell doors and exits the building. He merges into the frantic, surging tide of students sprinting across the campus lawns. He keeps his head down, matching their terrified pace, blending flawlessly into the agonizing chaos he alone created. The aftermath inside Building 12 is a sensory nightmare. The first arriving deputies breach the heavy doors and step into an apocalyptic landscape. Fire alarms continue their relentless, piercing shriek, making vocal communication nearly impossible. The air is thick with a choking suspension of pulverized drywall, the harsh chemical odor of burning cordite, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Overhead, sprinklers have engaged in some areas, mixing water with the gray dust to create a slick, hazardous paste on the linoleum. Hundreds of brass 5.56 casings crunch under the boots of tactical officers as they sweep the first-floor corridor. The sheer scale of the devastation is instantly apparent, but the absolute priority is neutralizing the active threat. A command post is hastily established outside to monitor the campus closed-circuit television system. A school employee, frantic and staring at a bank of monitors, begins relaying the suspect's movements to the officers over the radio. He reports the shooter ascending the west stairwell, moving down the second-floor hallway, raising his weapon. Tactical teams pivot immediately. They stack up against the heavy fire doors, weapons drawn, hearts hammering against their ribs. They breach the second floor, sweeping the angles, expecting a heavy firefight. They find nothing. The employee continues to call out coordinates. He reports the suspect is now on the third floor, moving toward the teacher's lounge. Heavily armed units sprint up the concrete steps, adrenaline flooding their systems, prepared to engage the targets. They burst onto the third-floor landing. Again, the corridor is empty. They are chasing a phantom. It takes an agonizing 20 minutes to realize the fatal miscommunication. The school's camera system was not feeding a live broadcast to the command post. The employee was scrubbing through recorded footage to locate the perpetrator, narrating his actions to police dispatch without explicitly stating the timeline. The SWAT teams had been hunting an echo. They were tracking a massacre that was already over, trapped in a digital dead end, while the real threat evaporated into the humid Florida afternoon. Outside the perimeter, the scene is a chaotic stampede. Thousands of teenagers sprint across the sprawling athletic fields and adjacent roads, scaling chain-link fences to escape the campus. The perpetrator is right in the middle of them. He jogs alongside the terrified masses, his head down, his breathing perfectly steady. He is wearing a maroon polo shirt, the official JROTC uniform of the very school he just decimated. It acts as the ultimate urban camouflage. In the eyes of the panicked crowd and the arriving first responders, he is just another traumatized student fleeing for his life. He slips right through the tightening police cordon. Cruisers fly past him at high speeds, their sirens wailing, rushing toward the epicenter of the crisis. He ignores them entirely. He leaves the campus boundaries behind and begins a 2.5-mile walk through the affluent, palm-lined streets of Parkland. The contrast is staggering. Back at the high school, paramedics are establishing triage zones on the grass, treating devastating combat-style trauma wounds. Here, on the quiet suburban sidewalks, the architect of the carnage simply puts one foot in front of the other under the baking sun. At 2:50 p.m., the sliding glass doors of a local Walmart supercenter part, and he walks inside. The sudden blast of cold air conditioning is a stark shift from the heavy outdoor heat. He bypasses the merchandise aisles and heads directly to a Subway counter located near the cash registers. He orders a cherry ice drink. He calmly reaches into his pocket, hands over the cash, and takes a sip. He strolls out of the store, the sugary beverage in hand. The sheer, chilling banality of the act defies all logic. He continues his pedestrian route, arriving at a nearby McDonald's a few minutes later. He walks in, completely unnoticed, and slides into a hard plastic booth. He spots another teenager sitting nearby, a student who had just evacuated the high school and sought refuge in the restaurant. The perpetrator leans over and casually asks the boy for a ride. The student, unaware of the true identity of the person sitting across from him but deeply unsettled by his cold, hollow demeanor, refuses the request and quickly leaves the building. Rejected, the killer sits alone in the booth for a few more moments before standing up and wandering back out into a quiet residential neighborhood. By 3:30 p.m., the horrifying realization that the shooter is off campus has finally circulated through the unified command center. The delayed camera footage is discarded. A massive multi-agency manhunt expands outward, shifting from a building clearing operation to a citywide grid search. Helicopters chop the air, casting sweeping shadows over the subdivisions. Dispatchers broadcast the physical description based on newly obtained eyewitness accounts. A young white male, maroon shirt, black pants, black baseball cap. 2 miles away, in the neighboring city of Coral Springs, Officer Michael Leonard is cruising down Wyndham Lakes Boulevard. The residential street is eerily quiet, shielded by tall hedges and manicured trees. At 3:41 p.m., Leonard spots a lone figure walking on the sidewalk. The clothing is a perfect match. The physical build is a perfect match. Leonard slows his cruiser and pulls abruptly to the curb. He draws his sidearm, leveling it through the open window, and issues a hard, uncompromising command for the individual to get on the ground. There is no final shootout. There is no desperate foot chase or ideological last stand. The teenager simply stops, looks at the officer, and lowers himself to the grass. He complies with every order. As handcuffs are ratcheted tightly around his wrists, he offers no resistance, no manifesto, no explanation. He simply complains to the arresting officer that his stomach hurts. The intense county-wide manhunt concludes not in a blaze of gunfire, but with a quiet, pathetic surrender on a pristine suburban lawn. Inside the Broward Sheriff's Office, the interrogation room is stark, brightly lit, and freezing. The teenager sits hunched over a metal table, stripped of his maroon polo shirt and dressed in light hospital scrubs. Detective John Kershaw takes the lead, initiating a psychological chess match that will last for hours. The suspect's demeanor oscillates between pathetic whimpering and a chilling, blank detachment. He immediately attempts to establish a defense mechanism, claiming he was guided by a dark voice. a demon that took residence in his head and commanded him to burn, kill, and destroy. Curcio listens, but he does not entertain the performance. Through methodical, indirect questioning, the investigator systematically deconstructs the insanity narrative right there in the room. He forces the suspect to confront the absolute, cold-blooded premeditation of his actions. The detective points out the undeniable logistics. A demon did not order a rideshare to the exact location. A demon did not consciously pack a heavy tactical vest with multiple magazines. A demon did not aim through the narrow glass panels of specific classroom doors to maximize the body count. When asked directly why he purchased the AR-15 in the first place, the suspect drops the supernatural facade and simply states that it looked cool. When the detective steps out of the room, hidden cameras capture the suspect's behavior. Believing he is alone, he begins a crude, theatrical display of mental illness, scratching at his own arms, punching himself in the face, and muttering toward the ceiling. He later begs the detective to kill him, expressing a sudden desire to die. Yet the investigator notes the glaring paradox. Just hours earlier, when the teenager held a loaded weapon and had the opportunity to end his own life, he chose instead to carefully abandon his rifle, discard his tactical gear, and blend in with the fleeing crowd to ensure his own survival. The profile that solidifies in the interrogation room is not one of a boy legally blind to reality, but of a calculating, deeply resentful individual who fully comprehended the magnitude of his violence. Meanwhile, the perimeter of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School is locked down under the glare of heavy floodlights. Building 12 has been transformed from an educational facility into a grim, multi-story time capsule. Forensic technicians begin the agonizing process of mapping the ballistic devastation. Every spent 5.56 casing, every shattered pane of impact glass, every blood trail must be painstakingly documented. But the most devastating element for the seasoned crime scene investigators is not visual, it is auditory. In the desolate, darkened corridors, cell phones ring incessantly. They buzz from inside abandoned, dust-covered backpacks and chime from the pockets of those who did not survive. It is an unbroken, agonizing audio loop of desperate mothers and fathers reaching out into the void. The technicians must work methodically around these vibrating devices, forced to tune out the digital cries for help while they process the trajectories of the high-velocity rounds that tore through the cinder block. 2 miles away, the Marriott Hotel in Coral Springs has become a localized purgatory. Hundreds of frantic parents were directed to the hotel ballrooms to await reunification. Throughout the late afternoon, buses transport surviving students to the staging area, resulting in tearful, chaotic embraces in the parking lot. But as the hours bleed into the deep night, the crowd of waiting parents slowly thins out, until only a small, terrified fraction remains. Authorities begin separating these last families, pulling them into private, partitioned rooms. The questions asked by the officials are clinical and horrifying. They request dental records. They inquire about distinct birthmarks, the exact brand of sneakers, or the color of the shirt their child put on that morning. A crushing reality drops over the remaining families. If a child had not texted by midnight, they were never coming home. The sudden wails of profound, shattered grief that echo through the hotel corridors mark the exact moment the community's soul is fractured beyond repair. By sunrise, the affluent bubble of Parkland is unrecognizable. The initial paralysis of grief instantly mutates into a highly volatile, unprecedented anger. This was a community that believed it had purchased immunity from the world's horrors through high property taxes and gated neighborhoods, only to realize the threat had been incubating in plain sight. The social echo reverberates violently as documented facts replace initial rumors. The public learns about the repeated, explicit FBI tips that were inexplicably archived without action. They read the logs detailing the dozens of times local deputies were dispatched to the suspect's home for violent behavior, resulting in zero legal constraints on his ability to purchase an arsenal. The most devastating revelation strikes when it is confirmed that an armed school resource officer took cover outside Building 12 during the entire duration of the massacre, failing to breach the doors and confront the shooter. The citizens of Parkland realized this tragedy was not an unpredictable act of nature. It was a catastrophic, multi-agency collapse. Vigils are held in the local parks, but the candlelight illuminates faces hardened by fury. The surviving teenagers refuse to grieve quietly, commanding international media attention to demand accountability from local law enforcement and federal lawmakers. The atmosphere in the city turns electric, permanently altering Parkland's identity from a quiet suburban sanctuary to ground zero for a furious, unyielding demand for systemic change. The legal machinery grinds slowly. For 4 agonizing years, procedural battles and pandemic delays stall the final reckoning. In late 2021, the perpetrator formally pleads guilty to all 17 counts of first-degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. The proceedings shift entirely to a penalty phase in the summer of 2022. The sole question remaining for the jury is whether he will face execution or spend the rest of his natural life in a concrete cell. The courtroom environment is punishing. Prosecutors systematically reconstruct the massacre, confronting the 12 jurors with unedited crime scene footage and detailed autopsy reports. Grieving parents and siblings take the stand, delivering raw, devastating testimonies that outline the permanent craters left in their families. The defense counters by spotlighting the perpetrator's broken neurological foundation. Medical experts testify that his biological mother's heavy drinking during pregnancy resulted in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, causing irreversible brain damage. His legal team argues that this biological handicap, combined with a lifetime of profound isolation and administrative failures, severely impaired his capacity for basic human empathy and impulse control. Florida law mandates a unanimous vote for a death sentence. In October 2022, the jury emerges divided. 3 jurors conclude that his severe mental deficits constitute mitigating factors that outweigh the sheer brutality of the attack. That lack of absolute consensus immediately triggers the default mandate. The perpetrator is sentenced to 34 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, permanently removing the threat of lethal injection. There is no true closure in Parkland, only a heavy, enduring silence. For years, Building 12 stood exactly as it was left, a looming, bullet-pocked monument to institutional collapse. Behind chain-link fencing, the blood-stained floors and shattered glass remained frozen in time. Demolition crews eventually leveled the structure, but the psychological crater is permanent. 17 futures were erased by a threat everyone saw coming, yet no one stopped. The court delivered a final sentence, but it can never undo the agonizing reality of those 6 minutes, or the catastrophic bureaucratic blindness that allowed them to happen. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. St. Margaret's Churchyard in Barking is a historic, quiet patch of green in East London. Over 15 months, it became an open-air dumping ground for a serial killer. 4 young men were found dead within a few hundred feet of each other, propped against stone walls or discarded under trees. The real horror wasn't just the murders. It was that the police walked right past the bodies, dismissing a mounting pile of corpses as isolated accidents. While authorities looked the other way, a predator operated in plain sight, hunting from his smartphone. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Barking is a dense East London district where the historical collides with the industrial. It is a landscape defined by concrete housing estates, transit hubs, and a constantly shifting population. Nestled within this grid sits Cook Street, an unremarkable row of flats. The geographic radius of the impending tragedy was suffocatingly small. The entire hunting ground, the kill site, and the graveyard existed within a footprint of barely a quarter mile. Living at 58 Cook Street was Stephen Port. Approaching 40, he presented a profoundly mundane figure. He worked antisocial hours as a chef at a bus garage, preparing meals for transit workers. Neighbors perceived him as a quiet, solitary individual. His physical appearance was unassuming, tall but slumping, naturally bald. though he frequently wore an unconvincing blonde toupee. Inside his flat, the environment was strangely juvenile. He hoarded action figures, arranging them obsessively across his furniture. It was an existence defined by deep isolation. There were no outward signs of aggression, and absolutely nothing to alert law enforcement to the predator residing in their jurisdiction. That was only Port's physical reality. The true scope of his psychological landscape existed entirely online. Behind locked doors, he cultivated a sprawling digital empire built on deception. Proximity-based dating applications had altered how people connected, and Port weaponized this architecture. He maintained dozens of fake profiles across multiple platforms, curating personas that projected everything he lacked: wealth, physical fitness, and professional success. Using stolen photographs of models and military personnel, he created irresistible digital honey traps. This activity was not an attempt at genuine connection. It was an obsessive pursuit of total control, rooted in extreme fetishes. Port fixated on drug-induced compliance. He spent hundreds of hours scouring obscure internet forums, researching the physiological effects of various compounds. He needed to know the exact dosage required to render an adult male completely unconscious without instantly stopping his heart. His chemical weapon became gamma-hydroxybutyrate, GHB. While used recreationally in fractional quantities, the massive doses Port prepared were designed to induce deep, unrousable comas. His smartphone offered an endless, scrolling menu of targets passing within thousands of feet of his door. Into this invisible web stepped Anthony Walgate. At 23 years old, the fashion student from Hull was the absolute antithesis of his killer. Anthony was vibrant, ambitious, and entirely focused on building a career in London's competitive design industry. Peers recognized his rare creative spark and magnetic energy. He was meticulously constructing a bright future. Surviving in an expensive metropolis required capital. To fund his heavy tuition, Anthony occasionally engaged in escort work. It was a pragmatic, transactional decision. He understood the inherent risks of meeting strangers, usually relying on strict safety protocols and checking in with friends to monitor his location. In June 2014, Anthony's path intersected with one of Port's fabricated personas. The predator offered a highly lucrative sum for an overnight booking, an amount significant enough to persuade the student to travel eastward. Anthony believed he was meeting a wealthy, sophisticated client. He was an entrepreneur fulfilling a contract, completely unaware he was walking into a meticulously researched chemical snare set by a man hiding behind a digital mask. The smartphone screen glowed in the dim light of the Cook Street flat, illuminating a scrolling grid of faces. In 2014, the architecture of dating applications was still relatively novel, built on a foundation of GPS tracking and instant gratification. For a predator, it was a revolution. There was no need to stalk alleyways or lurk in physical shadows. The hunt had been digitized. Port could sit on his worn sofa surrounded by children's toys, watching the exact distance between himself and his targets update in real time, shrinking from miles to feet. He understood that proximity was only half the trap. The other half was psychological manipulation. The men he targeted were young, often navigating the heavy financial pressures of London, or dealing with the profound isolation of moving to a new, unforgiving city. Port exploited these specific vulnerabilities by engineering a stable of highly curated digital avatars. He was never Stephen Port, the bus garage chef. Instead, he presented himself as an Oxford-educated scholar, a wealthy investor, or a rugged military officer. He stole photographs from legitimate social media accounts, crafting backstories with meticulous detail to project wealth, authority, and security. He did not just cast a wide net, he tailored the bait. The cornerstone of his methodology was the introduction of synthetic chemicals. Port spent extensive time on underground forums studying the physiological effects of gamma-hydroxybutyrate and its precursor, gamma-butyrolactone. Referred to simply as G or liquid ecstasy, it is essentially an industrial solvent. In fractional quantities, it lowers inhibitions. But the margin between a euphoric high and total respiratory failure is microscopic, often just a few milliliters. Port was not a precision chemist. He was a man pouring a salty, slightly metallic liquid into a glass of soda or juice, completely indifferent to that lethal margin. He wasn't looking for a shared recreational experience. He was engineering total, paralyzing compliance. The drug acts quickly on the central nervous system, dropping the core body temperature and depressing the heart rate until the victim slips into a deep, unrousable coma. That was the ultimate goal. Total control over a helpless physical form. This was the invisible snare Anthony Walgate walked toward in the second week of June. The digital negotiations had been brisk. Operating under a pseudonym, Port recognized the student's need for capital. Fashion school in the capital required endless funding for materials and tuition. The Avatar offered an exorbitant fee for a single overnight booking, reportedly around £800. It was an amount specifically calculated to override any instinctual hesitation. Anthony was not naive. He operated within a dangerous industry and understood the absolute necessity of safety protocols. Before leaving his own apartment, he engaged his standard contingency plan. He contacted a close friend, explicitly detailing his plans for the evening. He provided the exact address he was heading to in Barking. He established a timeline for when he would check in next. He left a clear, unmistakable digital breadcrumb trail, trusting that if something went wrong, his location was logged. On the evening of June 18th, Anthony navigated the heavy transit systems of the London Underground. He rode the District Line as it pushed further east, the dense historic architecture of the city center gradually giving way to the gray, sprawling industrial zones of the outer boroughs. The atmosphere was typical of early summer in the city, warm, heavy, and stifling. As the train rattled toward the Barking station, Port was already preparing the environment. The liquid solvent was measured. The messages on the phone grew more frequent, guiding the young man step by step through the maze of residential streets. Anthony followed the digital map, his footsteps echoing on the concrete pavements, closing the final few hundred feet to the destination. He approached the ground floor entrance of 58 Cook Street. When the door finally opened, the psychological trap reached its critical juncture. The visual dissonance would have been immediate and jarring. The man standing in the doorway bore absolutely no resemblance to the polished, successful avatar from the application. Instead of a wealthy client, Anthony was faced with a tall, awkwardly slumping figure wearing an ill-fitting blonde hairpiece. But the promise of the cash was heavy in the air. The long journey east had already been made. In that split second of hesitation, standing on the threshold between the safety of the street and the claustrophobic interior of the flat, Anthony made the pragmatic decision to finish the job he was hired for. He stepped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, sealing him inside a meticulously designed nightmare. Within minutes, a glass was offered. The glass was handed over. The liquid inside was heavily laced with a sweet mixer, designed specifically to mask the sharp, metallic bite of the industrial solvent. Anthony consumed it. Gamma-hydroxybutyrate is brutal in its efficiency. It does not induce a gentle, drifting sleep. It aggressively attacks the central nervous system, crossing the blood-brain barrier with violent speed. Within minutes, Anthony's muscles went completely slack. The ambient hum of the flat faded from his awareness. His breathing became shallow, erratic, then ceased entirely. The room grew quiet. Port did not panic. There were no frantic attempts at resuscitation, no sudden remorse. He simply observed the physiological mechanics of death. The psychological thrill was the absolute control, turning a vibrant, ambitious youth into a compliant, inanimate object. But that object quickly became a logistical liability. Moving a human corpse is a violently physical endeavor. Dead weight is fiercely uncooperative. Joints lock, limbs drag. Port waited until the deep silence of the early morning hours on June 19th. The streets of Barking were deserted. He hoisted Anthony's 150-pound frame, wrestling it out the front door, across the threshold, and dragged him onto the harsh concrete of Cook Street. He left the student propped awkwardly against a brick wall, mere feet from his own entrance. Returning inside, Port picked up his phone. He dialed emergency services, fabricating a clinical, detached narrative for the operator. He claimed he had just returned from a night shift and stumbled upon an unconscious youth on the pavement. He feigned total ignorance. He provided no name. When the paramedics arrived, they found a body already cooling in the damp London air. Port watched the flashing lights from the safety of his window. The ease with which he escaped scrutiny emboldened him. He realized he had successfully manipulated the system. By August, the digital trap was reset. The second target was Gabriel Kovary, a 22-year-old Slovakian immigrant. Gabriel was drifting. He lacked a permanent address, slept on friends' sofas, and was desperately seeking stability in a new country. Port sensed this profound vulnerability. Operating under the guise of a generous local professional, he offered the young immigrant a spare room at Cook Street. Gabriel accepted the lifeline. The reality of the flat was starkly different from the digital promises. The environment was cramped, cluttered with juvenile action figures. But before Gabriel could safely extract himself, the chemical snare was sprung. The GHB was administered. The result was identical to the first. Gabriel succumbed to lethal toxicity on the worn sofa. Port now faced a more complex disposal. He could not leave a second body on his own doorstep without triggering alarms. He needed a graveyard. Less than a quarter mile from his flat lay St. Margaret's Churchyard. It is an ancient, sprawling patch of green, dotted with weathered headstones and thick foliage. It provided the perfect, obscured canvas. Port wrapped Gabriel's body in a bedsheet to minimize friction and prevent forensic transfer. He waited for the dead of night. Dragging a fully grown man through urban streets requires immense, sustained exertion. The sound of scuffing heels on asphalt, the heavy, labored breathing of the predator in the dark. Port hauled Gabriel into the churchyard, pulling him deep into the shadows near the abbey ruins. He positioned the body against a stone wall, leaving a pair of sunglasses resting bizarrely near the corpse. He turned around, walked back to Cook Street, and locked his door. The hunger for control rapidly escalated. Merely 3 weeks later, in September, 21-year-old Daniel Whitworth became the third target. Daniel was a chef from Gravesend, enticed to barking through the exact same predatory channels. Port's methodology was now practiced, efficient, and ruthlessly mechanical. The digital invitation, the arrival, the lethal dose of liquid ecstasy. Daniel died quickly on the floor of the Cook Street flat. This time, Port introduced an element of calculated narrative forgery. He recognized that the geographical proximity of the deaths might finally arouse suspicion. He needed a psychological smokescreen. Finding a piece of paper, Port drafted a fake suicide note. He wrote from Daniel's perspective, confessing to the accidental overdose of Gabriel Kovary. The forged letter claimed Daniel had panicked during a drug binge, dumped Gabriel's body, and was now taking his own life out of overwhelming guilt. It was an act of supreme arrogance. Port was essentially writing a script for the authorities, handing them a neatly packaged, closed case. Under the cover of darkness, Port transported Daniel to the exact same churchyard. He dragged the 160-pound frame over the damp grass, navigating the uneven terrain and centuries-old graves. He dumped Daniel's body less than a few dozen feet from where he had left Gabriel weeks prior. He carefully slipped the forged suicide note into the young man's clothing, ensuring it would be found during the initial physical examination. The sheer audacity of the staging was staggering. He relied entirely on the assumption that investigators would accept the easiest story available. A full year passed. The flat on Cook Street remained undisturbed by law enforcement. Port operated with absolute impunity. By September 2015, the digital hunting resumed. Jack Taylor, 25 years old, was a night shift forklift driver. He was physically robust, heavily built, and possessed a quiet, hard-working demeanor. Surveillance cameras captured the stark reality of the encounter. The footage showed the predator, unremarkable, slouched, and awkward, leading the muscular, athletic Jack through the fluorescent-lit barking station toward the domestic slaughterhouse. Inside, the solvent was deployed. The chemical did not discriminate against physical strength. The central nervous system failure was absolute. The heavy musculature went entirely slack. Jack died in the early hours. The disposal of Jack Taylor required extreme physical force. This was not a slight student. This was a heavily muscled warehouse worker. Port waited until 1 a.m. He gripped the dead weight. He dragged the body out of the flat, scraping across the linoleum, down the hall, and out into the biting autumn air. He retraced the exact same path to St. Margaret's Churchyard. The The physical toll of moving a man of Jack's size over a quarter mile was immense. Port leveraged brute force, sweating under the heavy load, hauling the frame inch by inch through the sleeping neighborhood. He pulled the remains through the iron gates of the cemetery. Exhausted, he discarded the body in the dirt near the rubbish bins bordering the sacred ground. He left the forklift driver abandoned like refuse, turning his back on the final victim, supremely confident that the authorities would, once again, fail to see the monster standing in the light. The morning after Anthony Walgate was found propped against the cold brickwork of Cook Street, the bureaucratic machinery of the local constabulary engaged and immediately stalled. Port had called emergency services, weaving a detached, fabricated narrative about stumbling upon an unconscious stranger after a night shift. When officers finally applied basic pressure, his story fractured. He admitted to hiring the student and moving the corpse out of his flat. For this obstruction, Port was charged with perverting the course of justice in early 2015. However, the system's myopic focus meant the inquiry halted right there. Despite possessing a dead body, a confessed liar, and the perpetrator's laptop, which was saturated with extreme chemical fetish material, the authorities classified the death as a non-suspicious overdose. Port was handed an 8-month sentence, served barely a fraction of it, and was quietly released back to Barking. In Hull, Anthony's family received the devastating news through a wall of institutional apathy. The detectives had categorized the victim based on his profession, and in their eyes, his lifestyle negated the necessity for a homicide unit. Weeks later, the historic churchyard became a focal point of supreme investigative negligence. The sheer statistical impossibility of the subsequent discoveries should have triggered a massive tactical response. A local dog walker, navigating the dew-soaked grass and weathered headstones near the abbey, ruins in late August, stumbled upon Gabriel Cavari. The body was slumped unnervingly against the crumbling masonry. Barely 3 weeks later, the morning air was split by the exact same dog walker's frantic call to dispatch. In the identical quadrant of the cemetery, nestled against the damp earth, lay Daniel Whitworth. The fatal levels of the industrial solvent found in their toxicology reports were staggering. The sheer volume required to kill an adult male so rapidly makes voluntary, recreational ingestion highly improbable, especially alone in a dark, outdoor setting. Yet the coroner's findings were rubber-stamped by detectives eager to clear their caseloads. The linchpin of this systemic failure rested on a single piece of lined paper, the forged suicide note planted on Daniel. Procedural doctrine dictates that such a document be subjected to rigorous forensic scrutiny, including handwriting analysis and fingerprinting. None of this occurred. The lead investigators sealed the note in a plastic evidence bag and treated it as an absolute truth. They summoned Daniel's parents to a sterile briefing room and delivered a fabricated reality, informing the grieving couple that their son had accidentally killed Gabriel during a drug binge and taken his own life in remorse. Daniel's parents immediately protested. They stated unequivocally that the handwriting did not match their son's. They explicitly pointed out that Daniel had no connection to Barking, no history of chemical abuse, and zero links to Gabriel Cavari. The officers listened to the distressed family, nodded politely, and formally closed the inquiry. The red flags were not just missed, they were actively buried. By late 2014, a heavy, paranoid atmosphere descended over the local community. Barking residents began connecting the dots that law enforcement aggressively ignored. Whispers circulated through the transit hubs and concrete housing estates. 3 young men had died under identical circumstances within a footprint of a few hundred feet. A local digital newspaper ran a speculative piece questioning the staggering coincidences. In response, the borough commander issued rigid statements meant to pacify the public. The official line was absolute. There was no evidence of foul play, no active predator, and the deaths were entirely unrelated. This blind spot was fueled by a lethal institutional bias. Because the victims were gay men and the chemical weapon was associated with the underground party scene, investigators viewed the corpses through a lens of moral judgment. They classified them as high-risk individuals who had simply pushed a dangerous habit too far. The police did not see a serial killer's dumping ground. They saw a localized nuisance. This profound apathy provided Port with his greatest camouflage. The absolute breaking point arrived in September 2015 with the discovery of Jack Taylor. Discarded by the churchyard rubbish bins, his death was instantly processed through the identical, flawed template. Overdose. Non-suspicious. Case closed. But the authorities severely miscalculated the resolve of the Taylor family. Jack's sisters possessed an intimate understanding of his baseline behavior. He was a forklift driver subject to random workplace drug testing. He was meticulously focused on his physical health and vehemently anti-drugs. He did not engage in chemical binges, and he certainly did not travel to a random East London cemetery to end his life. When the family was informed there would be no homicide investigation, their grief metastasized into absolute fury. They demanded access to the case files and were immediately stonewalled. The police explicitly refused to pull the localized surveillance footage from the train station, citing a lack of resources for a non-criminal matter. The sisters recognized that if the killer was going to be caught, they had to circumvent the constabulary entirely. They launched an aggressive civilian inquiry, breaking through Jack's passwords to retrace his final digital interactions. They mapped the agonizingly short route from the transit hub to the surrounding streets. They physically walked the pavement, identifying privately owned security cameras attached to local off-licenses and apartment blocks. They begged the proprietors to preserve the footage before the systems automatically overwrote the hard drives. Every hour mattered. The sisters were racing against digital decay, acting as the primary investigative force, while the actual detectives remained entrenched behind their desks, completely blind to the monster operating in their shadows. Jack's sisters refused to be dismissed. They understood the physical trail was evaporating by the hour. Their relentless civilian inquiry focused on the transit hub where their brother was last seen. By bypassing sluggish bureaucratic channels, they secured access to private security feeds from a local establishment near the Barking station. The grainy footage captured the early hours of the morning. It showed Jack, but he was not alone. Walking beside the heavily built warehouse worker was a tall, awkward figure. The man possessed a distinctive, slouched gait and wore a noticeably artificial blonde hairpiece. The sisters took this undeniable visual evidence directly to the station precinct. They laid the data on the desk. The constabulary's wall of apathy finally cracked. The narrative of an isolated, non-suspicious overdose was mathematically dead. A homicide investigation was retroactively triggered, driven entirely by the labor of grieving siblings. The image from the security feed was circulated through the internal police network. It did not take a master detective to connect the dots. A patrol officer stationed in the borough immediately recognized the man on the screen. It was the chef from the local bus garage. It was the resident of 58 Cook Street. It was the exact same individual who had placed the emergency call for the very first victim 15 months prior. The realization struck the precinct with the force of a physical blow. The authorities had processed 4 dead bodies within a 1,000-foot radius. They had the perpetrator in their interview room over a year ago. They had arrested him for lying about moving a corpse, and they had let him walk back to his flat to hunt 3 more times. The institutional embarrassment was absolute, quickly eclipsed by the urgent, frantic need to secure the predator before his smartphone lured a 5th target. Detectives descended on the ground floor flat. The perimeter was secured rapidly. Port was taken into custody without a physical struggle. He exhibited the same flat, emotionless demeanor that defined his digital avatars. Crime scene investigators breached the front door, stepping directly into the nucleus of the trap. The interior of the flat offered an unsettling contrast to the lethal efficiency of the crimes. It was aggressively mundane. Surfaces were cluttered with rows of children's action figures and cheap electronics. However, hidden among the juvenile detritus were the mechanics of a serial predator. Forensics recovered multiple bottles containing trace amounts of the industrial solvent. They found the blonde hair pieces used as physical camouflage. More importantly, they secured the central nervous system of the entire operation, Port's primary laptop and smartphone. The physical evidence merely corroborated the location. The real investigation would take place inside the silicon drives. Digital analysts ripped through the encrypted layers of Port's hardware. What they uncovered was a staggering chronicle of predatory calculation. The search history was not a record of recreational curiosity. It was a blueprint for murder. Analysts found hundreds of specific queries regarding the exact chemical properties of liquid ecstasy. Port had systematically researched the precise dosage required to induce a permanent coma in a 150-pound male. He studied how quickly the solvent broke down in the human bloodstream, actively seeking methods to ensure the chemical would be untraceable by standard toxicology screens. The timeline of his internet activity was damning. In the days preceding each death, Port's search volume spiked. He cross-referenced drug lethality with queries on how to dispose of dead weight. GPS metadata from his mobile device placed him exactly at the Abbey ruins during the precise early morning windows when Gabriel and Daniel were abandoned. The most devastating piece of digital evidence was a deleted text file recovered from the hard drive. It was the original draft of the forged suicide note planted on Daniel Whitworth. The digital timestamp proved Port had composed the fake confession before the young chef even arrived in Barking. The premeditation was absolute. It completely dismantled any potential defense of an accidental overdose. He had authored the cover-up before administering the poison. Furthermore, the devices held thousands of communications across various proximity applications. Detectives watched the digital trap spring shut in reverse. They read the false promises, the weaponized charm, and the calculated financial lures used to draw the targets into the quarter-mile kill zone. Port had viewed the dating grid as a takeout menu, selecting victims based on their physical vulnerability and perceived lack of social safety nets. Inside the sterile confines of the police interview room, the interrogation commenced. Port was presented with the overwhelming mountain of digital and forensic proof. His reaction lacked any human depth. There was no panic, no tearful confession, no desperate plea for understanding. He sat rigidly, his body language closed off, his eyes completely dead. He offered a weak, shifting narrative. He insisted to the detectives that the deaths were simply tragic accidents resulting from consensual encounters. He claimed the young men had voluntarily ingested the fatal doses themselves. When confronted with the recovered draft of the forged suicide note, his defense crumbled into silence. He utilized his legal right to offer no comment. He refused to articulate any genuine motive. He would not explain why he targeted those specific individuals, nor why he chose the churchyard as his personal dumping ground. The psychological profile crystallized for the investigators sitting across the table. They were dealing with an individual entirely devoid of empathy. To the killer, the victims were never human beings with families, careers, and futures. They were merely physical objects, required to fulfill an obsessive fantasy of total control. Once that control was achieved and the biological function ceased, the objects became waste, to be dragged through the dirt and discarded against stone walls. The digital mask was permanently stripped away, leaving only a cold, mechanical reality. In October 2016, the prosecution laid out the full scale of the digital slaughterhouse at the Old Bailey in London. The trial did not rely on sudden courtroom revelations. It was built on the cold, indisputable architecture of GPS coordinates, time-stamped internet searches, and the precise chemical breakdown of the industrial solvent. The jury was shown exactly how a single, unremarkable ground floor flat had been weaponized. Port maintained his fabricated narrative throughout the proceedings, insisting the lethal doses were consensual and self-administered. He attempted to present himself as a victim of tragic coincidences, a man who simply panicked when 4 separate men died on his sofa over a 15-month period. The prosecution methodically dismantled this defense. The deleted draft of the forged suicide note was the anchor of their case. That single digital file proved absolute premeditation, destroying any illusion of accidental overdose. The jury required only a few days to cut through the deception. In late November, they returned guilty verdicts for the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Caveri, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. The judge imposed a whole life order. Stephen Port will die in a high-security cell, permanently stripped of the control he spent years cultivating online. The physical predator was finally locked away. The cell door locking did not erase the profound failure of the system. In 2021, and concluding in 2022, a formal inquest brutally laid bare the institutional blindness of the local authorities. The findings were stark. Fundamental investigative errors and deep-rooted prejudice allowed a predator to operate with absolute impunity. Justice was eventually forced by grieving families, but it was neither swift nor proactive. Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel, and Jack were not just victims of a killer. They were casualties of a system that simply refused to look. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.